Part 10 of Anne Severn and the Fieldings by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 10. Eliot. Chapter 1. Eliot stood in the porch of the Manor Farm house. There was nobody there to greet him. Behind him on the oak table in the hall, the wire he had sent lay unopened. It was midday in June. All round the place the air was sweet with the smell of the mown hay, and from the broad pasture there came the rattle and throb of the mowing machines. Eliot went down the road and through the gate into the hayfield. Colin and Anne were there. Anne at the top of the field drove the mower, mounted up on the shell-shaped iron seat, white against the blue sky. Colin at the bottom, slender and tall above the big revolving wheel, drove the rake. The tedding machine, driven by a farmhand, went between. Its iron-toothed rack caught the new-mown hay, tossed it and scattered it on the field. Beside the long glistening swaths, the cut edge of the hay stood up clean and solid as a wall. Above it the raised plain of the grass-tops, brushed by the wind, quivered and swayed, whitish-green, greenish-white, in a long shimmering undulation. Eliot went on to meet Anne and Colin as they turned and came up the field again. When they saw him they jumped down and came running. "Eliot, you never told us." "I wired at 9 this morning." "There's nobody in the house, and we've not been in since breakfast at 7," Colin said. "Well, it's 12 now. Time you knocked off for lunch, isn't it?" "Are you all right, Eliot?" said Anne. "Rather." He gave a long look at them, at their sunburnt faces, at their clean, slender grace, Colin in his cricketing flannels, and Anne in her land girl's white linen coat, knickerbockers and grey wideawake. "Colin doesn't look as if there was much the matter with him. He might have been farming all his life." "So I have," said Colin, "considering that I haven't lived till now." And they went back together towards the house. Chapter 2. Colin's and Anne's work was done for the day. The hay in the broad pasture was mown and dried. Tomorrow it would be heaped into cocks and carried to the stackyard. It was the evening of Eliot's first day. He and Anne sat out under the apple tree in the orchard. "What on earth have you done to Colin?" he said. "I expected to find him a perfect wreck." "He was pretty bad 3 months ago. But it's good for him being down here in the place he used to be happy in. He knows he's safe here. It's good for him doing jobs about the farm, too." "I imagine it's good for him being with you." "Oh, well, he knows he's safe with me." "Very safe. He owes it to you that he's sane now. You must have been astonishingly wise with him." "It didn't take much wisdom. Not more than it used to take when he was a little frightened kid. That's all he was when he came back from the war, Eliot. The point is that you haven't treated him like a kid. You've made a man of him again. You've given him a man's life and a man's work." "That's what I want to do. When he's trained he can look after Jerrold's land. You know poor Barker died last month of septic pneumonia. The camp was full of it." "I know. What do you think of my training Colin?" "It's all right for him, Anne. But what about you?" "Me? Oh, I'm all right. You needn't worry about me." "I do worry about you. And your father's worrying." "Dear old Daddy. It is silly of him. As if anything mattered but Colin." "You matter. You see, your father doesn't like your being here alone with him. He's afraid of what people may think." "Oh, I'm not. I don't care what people think. They've got no business to." "No, but they will, and they do. You know what I mean, Anne, don't you?" "I suppose you mean they think I'm Colin's mistress. Is that it?" "I'm afraid it is. They can't think anything else. It's beastly of them, I know, but this is a beastly world, dear, and it doesn't do to go on behaving as if it wasn't." "I don't care. If people are beastly it's their lookout, not mine. The beastlier they are, the less I care." "I don't suppose you care if the vicar's wife won't call or if Lady Corbett and the Hawtreys cut you. But that's why." "Is it? I never thought about it. I'm too busy to go and see them, and I suppose they were too busy to come and see me. I certainly don't care." "If it was people you cared about?" "Nobody I care about would think things like that of me." "Anne dear, I'm not so sure." "Then it shows how much they care about me." "But it's because they care." "I can't help it. They may care, but they don't know. They can't know anything about me if they think that." "And you honestly don't mind?" "I mind what you think. But you don't think it, Eliot, do you?" "I? Good Lord, no. Do you mind what Mother thinks?" "Yes, I mind. But it doesn't matter very much." "It would matter if Jerrold thought it." "Oh, Eliot, does he?" "I don't suppose he thinks precisely that. But I'm pretty sure he thought you and Colin cared for each other." "What makes you think so?" "His marrying Maisie like that." "Why shouldn't he marry her?" "Because it's you he cares about." Eliot's voice was quiet and heavy. She knew that what he said was true. That quiet, heavy voice was the voice of her own innermost conviction. Yet under the shock of it she sat silent, not looking at him, looking with wide, fixed eyes at the pattern the apple boughs made on the sky. "How do you know?" she said presently. "Because of the way he talked to Mother before he came to see you here. She says he was frightfully upset when she told him about you and Colin." "She told him that?" "Apparently. What did she do it for, Eliot?" "What does Mother do anything for? I imagine she wanted to put Jerrold off so that you could stick on with Colin. You've taken him off her hands and she wants him kept off." "So she told him I was Colin's mistress? Mind you, she doesn't think a bit the worse of you for that. She admires you for it no end." "Do you suppose I care what she thinks? It's her making Jerrold think it. Eliot, how could she?" "She could because she only sees things as they affect herself." "Do you believe she really thinks it?" "She's made herself think it because she wanted to." "But why? Why should she want to?" "I've told you why. She's afraid of having to look after Colin. I've no illusions about Mother. She's always been like that. She wouldn't see what she was doing to you. Before she did it she'd persuaded herself that it was Colin and not Jerrold that you cared for. And she wouldn't do it deliberately at all. I know it has all the effect of low cunning, but it isn't. It's just one of her sudden movements. She'd rush into it on a blind impulse." Anne saw it all. She saw that Adeline had slandered her to Jerrold and to Eliot, that she had made use of her love for Colin, which was her love for Jerrold, to betray her, that she had betrayed her to safeguard her own happy life without pity and without remorse. She had done all of these things and none of them. They were the instinctive movements of her funk. Where Adeline's ease and happiness were concerned, she was one incarnate funk. You couldn't think of her as a reasonable and responsible being, to be forgiven or unforgiven. "It doesn't matter how she did it. It's done now," she said. "Really, Anne, it was too bad of Colin. He oughtn't to have let you." "Oh, he couldn't help it, poor darling. He wasn't in a state. Don't put that into his head. It just had to happen. I don't care, Eliot. If it was to be done again to morrow I'd do it. Only if I'd known I could have told Jerrold the truth. The others can think what they like. It'll only make me stick to Colin all the more. I promised Jerrold I'd look after him, and I shall as long as he wants me. It serves them all right. They all left him to me. Daddy and Aunt Adeline and Queenie, I mean, and they can't stop me now." "Mother doesn't want to stop you. It's your father." "I'll write and tell Daddy. Besides, it's too late. If I left Colin to morrow it wouldn't stop the scandal. My reputation's gone and I can't get it back, can I?" "Dear Anne, you don't know how adorable you are without it." "Look here, Eliot, what did your mother tell you for?" "Same reason. To put me off, too." They looked at each other and smiled. Across their memories, across the years of war, across Anne's agony they smiled. Besides its courage and its young, candid cynicism, Anne's smile expressed her utter trust in him. As if, Eliot said, it would have made the smallest difference. "Wouldn't it have?" "No, Anne. Nothing would." "That's what Jerrold said. And he thought it. I wondered what he meant." "He meant what I mean." The moments passed, ticked off by the beating of his heart, time and his heart beating violently together. Not one of them was his moment, not one would serve him for what he had to say, falling so close on their intolerable conversation. He meant to ask Anne to marry him, but if he did it now she would suspect him of chivalry. It would look as if he wanted to make up to her for all she had lost through Colin, as if he wanted more than anything to save her. So Eliot, who had waited so long, waited a little longer, till the evening of his last day. iii Anne had gone up with him to Wyck Manor to see the soldiers. Ever since they had come there she had taken cream and fruit to them twice a week from the farm. Unaware of what was thought of her, She never knew that the scandal of young Fielding and Miss Severn had penetrated the convalescent home with the fruit and cream. And if she had known it she would not have stayed away. People's beastliness was no reason why she shouldn't go where she wanted, where she had always gone. The convalescent home belonged to the Fieldings, and the Fieldings were her dearest friends who had been turned into relations by her father's marriage. So this evening, absorbed in the convalescence, she never saw the matron's queer look at her, or her pointed way of talking only to Eliot. Eliot saw it. He thought, "It doesn't matter. She's so utterly good that nothing can touch her. All the same, if she marries me, she'll be safe from this sort of thing." They had come to the dip of the valley and the Manor Farm water. "Let's go up the beech walk," he said. They went up and sat in the beech ring where Anne had sat with Jerrold 3 months ago. Eliot never realized how repeatedly Jerrold had been before him. "Anne," he said, "it's more than 5 years since I asked you to marry me." "Is it, Eliot? Do you remember I said then I'd never give you up?" "I remember. Unless Jerrold got me, you said. Well, he hasn't got me." "I wouldn't want you to tie yourself up with me if there was the remotest chance of Jerrold. But as there isn't, don't you think—" "No, Eliot, I don't." "But you do care for me, Anne, a little. I know you do." "I care for you a great deal. But not in that sort of way." "I'm not asking you to care for me in the way you care for Jerrold. You may care for me any way you please if you'll only marry me. You don't know how awfully little I'd be content to take." "I shouldn't be content to give it, though. You oughtn't to have anything but the best." "It would be the best for me, you see." "Oh, no, Eliot, it wouldn't. You only think it would because you're an angel. It would be awful of me to give so little when I take such a lot. I know what your loving would be." "If you know, you must have thought of it. And if you've thought of it—" "I've only thought of it to see how impossible it is. It mightn't be if I could leave off loving Jerrold, but I can't. Eliot, I've got the queerest feeling about him. I know you'll think me mad when he's gone and married somebody else, but I feel all the time as if he hadn't, as if he belonged to me and always had, and I to him. Whoever Maisie's married, it isn't Jerrold. Not the real Jerrold." "Well, the fact remains that she's married him." "No. Not him. Only a bit of him. Some bit that doesn't matter." "Anne darling, I'd try not to think that." "I don't think it. I feel it. Down there, deep inside me. I've always felt that Jerrold would come back to me. And he came back. Then there was Colin. He'll come back again." "Then there'll be Maisie." "No. Then there won't be Maisie. There won't be anything if he really comes. Now you see how mad I am. Now you see how awful it would be to marry me." "No, Anne. I see it's the only way to keep you safe." "Safe from what? Safe from Jerrold? I don't want to be safe from him. Eliot, I'm telling you this because you trust me. I want you to see me as I really am, so that you won't want to marry me any more." "Ah, that's not the way to make me. Nothing you say makes any difference. Nothing you could do would make any difference." "Supposing it had been true what your mother said, wouldn't that?" "No. If you'd given yourself to Colin I should only have thought it was your goodness. It would have been good because you did it." "How queer. That's what Jerrold said. Then he did love me." "I told you he loved you." "I don't care. Nothing else matters." "That's all you have to say to me?" "Yes. Unless I lie." "You'd lie for Jerrold." "For him. Not to him. I should never need to." "You've no need to lie to me, dear. I know you better than he does. You forget that I didn't think what he thought." "That only shows that he knew." "Knew what?" "What I am. What I might do if I really cared." "There are things you'd never do. You'd never do anything mean or dishonorable or cruel." "Oh, you don't know what I'd do. Don't worry, Eliot. I shall be too busy with the land and with Colin to do very much." "I'm not worrying." All the same he wondered which of them knew Anne best, he or Anne herself or Jerrold. End of Part 10, recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 11 of Anne Severn and the Fieldings by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 11. Interim. Chapter 1. Colin thought with terror of the time when Queenie would come back from the war. At any moment she might get leave and come. If she had not had it yet, that only made it more likely that she would have it soon. The vague horror that waited for him every morning had turned into this definite fear of Queenie. He was afraid of her temper, of her voice and eyes, of her crude, malignant thoughts, of her hatred of Anne. More than anything he was afraid of her power over him, of her vehement, exhausting love. He was afraid of her beauty. One morning, early in September, the wire came. Colin shook with agitation as he read it. "What is it?" Anne said. "Queenie. She's got leave. She'll be here to day at 4:00. "Don't you want to see her?" "No, I don't." "Then you'd better drive over to Kingdon and look at those bullocks of Ledbury's." "I don't know anything about bullocks. They ought to be straight lines from their heads to their tails. That's about all I know." "Never mind. You'll have gone to look at bullocks. And you can tell Ledbury I'm coming over to morrow. Do you mind driving yourself?" Colin did mind. He was afraid to drive by himself, but he was much more afraid of Queenie. "You can take Harry and leave me to settle Queenie." Colin went off with Harry to Chipping Kingdon. And at 4:00 Queenie came. Her hard, fierce eyes stared past Anne, looking for Colin. "Where's Colin?" she said. "He had to go out, but he'll be back before dinner." Presently Queenie asked if she might go upstairs. As they went you could see her quick, inquisitive eyes sweeping and flashing. The door of Colin's room stood open. "Is that Colin's room?" "Yes." She went in, opened the inner door and looked into the gable room. "Who sleeps here?" she said. "I do," said Anne. "You?" "Have you any objection?" "You might as well sleep in my husband's room." "Oh no, this is near enough. I can tell whether he's asleep or awake." "Can you? And please, how long has this been going on?" "I've been sleeping in this room since November. Before that we had our old rooms at the Manor. There was a passage between, you remember, but I left the doors wide open." "I suppose," said Queenie with furious calm, "you want me to divorce him?" "Divorce him? Why on earth should you? Just because I looked after him at night? I had to. There wasn't anybody else. And he was afraid to sleep alone. He is still. But he's all right as long as he knows I'm there." "You expect me to believe that that's all there is in it?" "No, I don't, considering what your mind's like." "Oh, yes, when people do dirty things it's always other people's dirty minds. Do you imagine I'm a fool, Anne?" "You're an awful fool if you think Colin's my lover." "I think it, and I say it." "If you think it, you're a fool. If you say it, you're a liar. A damned liar." "And is Colin's mother a liar, too?" "Yes, but not a damned one. It would serve you jolly well right, Queenie, if he was my lover after the way you left him to me." "I didn't leave him to you. I left him to his mother." "Anyhow, you left him." "I couldn't help it. You were not wanted at the front, and I was. I couldn't leave hundreds of wounded soldiers just for Colin." "I had to. He was in an awful state. I've looked after him day and night. I've got him almost well now, and I think the least you can do is to keep quiet and let him alone." "I shall do nothing of the sort. I shall divorce him as soon as the war's over." "It isn't over yet. And I don't advise you to try. No decent barrister would touch your case. It's so rotten." "Not half so rotten as you'll look when it's in all the papers." "You can't frighten me that way." "Can't I? I suppose you'll say you were looking after him? As if that didn't make it all the more revolting. Nobody's going to believe it was Colin's fault." "Really, Queenie, you're too stupid for words. I shall say he was too tired, poor darling, if you do bring your silly old action. Only please don't do it till he's quite well, or he'll be ill again. I think that's tea going in. Will you go down?" They went down. Tea was laid in the big bare hall. The small round oak table brought them close together. Anne waited on Queenie with every appearance of polite attention. Queenie ate and drank in long, fierce silences, for her hunger was even more imperious than her pride. "I don't want to eat your food," she said at last. "I'm only doing it because I'm starving. I dined with Colin's mother last night. It was the first dinner I've eaten since I went to the war." "You needn't feel unhappy about it," said Anne. "It's Eliot's house and Jerrold's food. How's Cutler?" "Much the same as when you saw him," Queenie answered quietly, but her face was red. "And that Johnnie, what was his name, who took my place?" Queenie's flush darkened. She was holding her mouth so tight that the thin red line of the lips faded. "Noel Fenwick," said Anne, suddenly remembering. "What about him?" Queenie's throat moved as if she swallowed something big and hard. "Is he there still?" "He was when I left." Her angry, defiant eyes were fixed on the open doorway. You could see she was waiting for Colin, ready to fall on him and tear him as soon as he came in. "Am I to see Colin or not?" she said as she rose. "Have you anything to say to him?" "Only what I've said to you." "Then you won't see him. In fact, I think you'd better not see him at all." "You mean he funks it?" "I funk it for him. He isn't well enough to be raged at and threatened with proceedings. It'll upset him horribly, and I don't see what good it'll do you." "No more do I. I'm not going to live with him after this. You can tell him that. Tell him I don't want to see him or speak to him again." "I see. You just came down to make a row." "You don't suppose I came down to stay with you two?" Queenie was so far from coming down to stay that she had taken rooms for the night at the White Hart in Wyck. Anne drove her there. ii 2.5 years passed. Anne's work on the farm filled up her days and marked them. Her times were ploughing time and the time for sowing, wheat first and turnips after the wheat, barley after the turnips, sainfoin, grass and clover after the barley. Oats in the 5-acre field this year, in the 7-acre field the next. Lambing time, calving time, cross ploughing and harrowing, washing and shearing time, time for hoeing, hay time and harvest. Then threshing time and ploughing again. All summer the hard fight against the charlock, year after year the same. You harrowed it out and ploughed it down and sprayed it with sulphate of copper. You sowed vetches and winter corn to crowd it out. And always it sprang up again, flaring in bright yellow stripes and fans about the hills. The air was sweet with its smooth, delicious smell. Always the same clear-cut pattern of the fields. But the colours shifted. The slender, sharp-pointed triangle that was jade green last June, this June was yellowish brown. The square under the dark comb of the plantation that had been yellow brown was emerald. The wide open fan beside it that had been emerald was pink. By August the emerald had turned to red gold, and the jade green to white. These changes marked the months and the years, a bright, patterned, imperceptibly moving measure, rolling time off across the hills. 1916, 17, 1918 and the armistice, 1919 and the peace. III. In the spring of that year Anne and Colin were still together at the Manor Farm. He was stronger; but though he did more and more work every year, he was still unfit to take over the management himself. Responsibility fretted him and he tired soon. He could do nothing without Anne. He was now definitely separated from his wife. Queenie had come back from the war a year ago. As soon as it was over she had begun to rage and consult lawyers and write letters 2 or 3 times a week, threatening to drag Anne and Colin through the divorce court. But Miss Mullins, once the secretary of Dr. Cutler's Field Ambulance Corps, recovering at the farm from an excess of war work, reassured them. Queenie, she said, was only bluffing. Queenie was not in a position to bring an action against any husband, she had been too notorious herself. Miss Mullins had seen things, and she intimated that no defense could stand against the evidence she could give. And in the end Queenie left off talking about divorce and contented herself with a judicial separation. Colin still woke every morning to his dread of some blank, undefined disaster. But, as if Queenie and the war had made one obsession, he was no longer haunted by the imminent crash of phantom shells. It was settled that he was to live with Jerrold and Maisie when they came back to the Manor, while Anne stayed on by herself at the farm. Every now and then Eliot came down to see them. He had been sent home early in 1917 with a shrapnel wound in his left leg, the bone shattered. He obtained his discharge at the price of a permanent limp, and went back to his research work. For the last 2 years he had been investigating trench fever, with results that were to make him famous. But that was not for another year. In February, 1919, Jerrold had come back. He and Maisie had been living in London ever since he had left the army, filling in time till Wyck Manor would be no longer a home for convalescent soldiers. He had tried to crowd into this interval all the amusement he hadn't had for 4 years. His way was to crush down the past with the present, to pile up engagements against the future, party on party, dances on suppers and suppers on plays; to dine every evening at some place where they hadn't dined before; to meet lots of nice amusing people with demobilized minds who wouldn't talk to him about the war; to let himself go in bursts of exquisitely imbecile laughter; never to be quiet for an hour, never to be alone with himself, never to be long alone with Maisie. After the first week of it this sort of thing ceased to amuse him, but he went on with it because he thought it amused Maisie. There was something he missed, something he wanted and hadn't got. At night, when he lay awake, alone with himself at last, he knew that it was Anne. And he went on laughing and amusing Maisie, and Maisie, with a heart-breaking sweetness, laughed back at him and declared herself amused. She had never had such a jolly time in all her life, she said. Then, very early in the spring, Maisie went down to her people in Yorkshire to recover from the jolly time she had had. The convalescent soldiers had all gone, and Wyck Manor, rather worn and shabby, was Wyck Manor again. Jerrold came back to it alone. End of chapter 11. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 12 of Anne Severn and the Fieldings by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 12. Colin, Jerrold, and Anne. Chapter 1. He went through the wide empty house, looking through all the rooms, trying to find some memory of the happiness he had had there long ago. The house was full of Anne. Anne's figure crossed the floors before him, her head turned over her shoulder to see if he were coming. Her voice called to him from the doorways, her running feet sounded on the stairs. That was her place at the table. That was the armchair she used to curl up in. Just there on the landing he had kissed her when he went to school. They had given his mother's room to Maisie, and they had put his things into the room beyond, his father's room. Everything was in its place as it had been in his father's time, the great wardrobe, the white marble-topped washstand, the bed he had died on. He saw him lying there, and Anne going to and fro between the washstand and the bed. The parrot curtains hung from the windows, straight and still. Jerrold shuddered as he looked at these things. He had thought that he would want to sleep in that room because he was married, because Maisie would have the room it led out of. But he couldn't sleep in it. He couldn't stay in it a minute. He would never pass its door without that sickening pang of memory. He moved his things across the gallery into Anne's room. He would sleep there. He would sleep in the white bed that Anne had slept in. He told himself that he had to be near Colin. There was only the passage between, and their doors could stand open. That was why he wanted to sleep there. But he knew that was not why. He wanted to sleep there because there was no other room where he could feel Anne so near him, where he could see her so clearly. When the dawn came she would be with him, sitting in her chair by the window. The window looked to the west, to Upper Speed and the Manor Farm house. The house was down there behind the trees, and somewhere there, jutting out above the porch, was the window of Anne's room. He looked at his watch. 1:00. At 2 he would go and see Anne. II. When Jerrold called at the Manor Farm house Anne was out. Old Ballinger came slouching up from the farmyard to tell him that Miss Anne had gone up to the Far Acres field to try the new tractor. The Far Acres field lay at the western end of the estate. Jerrold followed her there. 5 furrows, 5 bright brown bands on the sallow stubble marked out the Far Acres into 5 plots. In the turning space at the top corner he saw Anne on her black horse and Colin standing beside her. With a great clanking and clanging the new American tractor struggled towards them up the hill, dragging its plough. It stopped and turned at the headland as Jerrold came up. A clear, light wind blew over the hill, and he felt a sudden happiness and excitement. He was beginning to take an interest in his land. He shouted, "I say, Anne, you look like Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo." "Oh, not Waterloo, I hope. I'm going to win my battle." "Well, Marengo, Austerlitz, whatever battles he did win. Does Curtis understand that infernal thing?" Young Curtis, sulky and stolid on his driver's seat, stared at his new master. "Yes. He's been taught motor mechanics. He's quite good at it. If only he'd do what you tell him. Curtis, I said you were not to use those disc coulters for this field. I've had 3 smashed in 2 weeks. They're no earthly good for stony soil." "'Tisn't so bad here as it is at the East End, miss." "Well, we'll see. You can let her go now." With a fearful grinding and clanking the tractor started. The revolving disc coulter cut the earth, the 3 great shares gripped it and turned it on one side. But the earth, instead of slanting off clear from the furrows, fell back again. Anne dismounted and ran after the tractor and stopped it. "He hasn't got his plough set right," she said. "It's too deep in." She stooped and did something mysterious and efficient with a lever. The wheels dipped, raising the shares to their right level, and the tractor set off again. This time the earth parted clean from the furrows with a noise of surge, and 3 slanting, glistening waves ran the length of the field in the wake of the triple plough. "Oh, Jerrold, look at those 3 lovely furrows. Look at the pace it goes. This field will be ploughed up in a day or 2. Colin, aren't you pleased?" The tractor was coming towards them, making a most horrible noise. "No," he said, "I don't like the row it makes. Can't I go, now that I've seen what the beastly thing can do?" "Yes, you'd better go if you can't stand it." Colin went with quick, desperate strides down the field, away from the terrifying sound of the tractor. They looked after him sorrowfully. "He's not right yet. I don't think he'll ever be able to stand noises." "You must give him time, Anne." "Time? He's had 3 years. It's heart breaking. I must just keep him out of the way of the tractors, that's all." She mounted her horse and went riding up and down the field, abreast of the plough. Jerrold waited for her at the gate of the field. iii. It was Sunday evening between 5 and 6. Anne was in the house, in the great Jacobean room on the first floor. Barker had judged it too large and too dilapidated to live in, and it had been left empty in his time. Eliot had had it restored and Jerrold had furnished it. Black oak bookcases from the Manor stretched along the walls, for Jerrold had given Eliot half of their father's books. This room would be Eliot's library when he came down. It was now Anne's sitting room. The leaded windows were thrown open to the grey evening and a drizzling rain, but a fire blazed on the great hearth under the arch of the carved stone chimney piece. Anne's couch was drawn up before it. She lay stretched out on it, tired with her week's work. She was all alone in the house. The gardener and his wife went out together every Sunday to spend the evening with their families at Medlicote or Wyck. She was not sorry when they were gone. The stillness of the house rested her. But she missed Colin. Last Sunday he had been there, sitting beside her in his chair by the hearth, reading. Today he was with Jerrold at the Manor. The soft drizzle turned to a quick patter of rain, a curtain of rain fell, covering the grey fields between the farm and the Manor, cutting her off. She was listening to the rain when she heard the click of the gate and feet on the garden path. They stopped on the flagstones under her window. Jerrold's voice called up to her. "Anne. Anne, are you there? Can I come up?" "Rather." He came rushing up the stairs. He was in the room now. "How nice of you to come on this beastly evening." "That's why I came. I thought it would be so rotten for you all alone down here." "What have you done with Colin?" "Left him up there. He was making no end of a row on the piano." "Oh, Jerrold, if he's playing again he'll be all right." He didn't sound as if there was much the matter with him. "You never can tell. He can't stand those tractors." "We must keep him away from the beastly things. I suppose we've got to have 'em." "I'm afraid so. They save no end of labour, and labour's short and dear." "Is that why you've been working yourself to death?" "I haven't. Why, do I look dead?" "No. Eliot told me. He saw you at it." "I only take a hand at hay time and harvest. All the rest of the year it's just riding about and seeing that other people work. And Colin does half of that now." "All the same, I think it's about time you stopped." "But if I stop, the whole thing'll stop. The men must have somebody over them." "There's me." "You don't know anything about farming, Jerry dear. You don't know a teg from a wether." "I suppose I can learn, if Colin's learnt. Or I can get another Barker." "Not so easy. Don't you like my looking after your land, then? Aren't you pleased with me? I haven't done so badly, you know. 700 acres." "You've been simply splendid. I shall never forget what you've done. And I shall never forgive myself for letting you do it. I'd no idea what it meant." "It's only meant that Colin's better, and I've been happier than I ever thought I could have been." "Happier? Weren't you happy then?" She didn't answer. They were on dangerous ground. If they began talking about happiness... "If I gave it up to morrow," she said, "I should only go and work on another farm." "Would you?" "Jerrold, do you want me to go?" "Want you?" "Yes, you did once. At least you wanted to get away from me." "I didn't know what I was doing. If I had known I shouldn't have done it. I can't talk about that, Anne. It doesn't bear thinking about." "No. But, Jerrold, tell me the truth. Do you want me to go because of Colin?" "Colin?" "Yes. Because of what your mother told you." "How do you know what she told me?" "She told Eliot." "And he told you? Good God, what was he thinking of?" "He thought it better for me to know it. It was better." "How could it be? I can't tell you. Jerrold, it isn't true." "I know it isn't." "But you thought it was." "When did I think it?" "Then. When you came to see me." "Did I?" "Yes. And you're not going to lie about it now." "Well, if I did, I've paid for it." What did he mean? Paid for it? It was she who had paid. "When did you know it wasn't true?" she said. 3 months after, when Eliot wrote and told me. It was too late then. If only you'd told me at the time. Why didn't you?" "But I didn't know you thought it. How could I know?" "No. How could you? Who would have believed that things could have happened so damnably as that?" "But it's all right now. Why did you say it was too late?" "Because it was too late. I was married." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I lied when I told you it made no difference. It made that difference. If I hadn't thought that you and Colin were... If I hadn't thought that, I wouldn't have married Maisie. I'd have married you." "Don't say that, Jerrold." "Well, you asked for the truth, and there it is." She got up and walked away from him to the window. He followed her there. She spread out her hands to the cold rain. "It's raining still," she said. He caught back her hands. "Would you have married me?" "Don't, Jerrold, don't. It's cruel of you." He was holding her by her hands. "Would you? Tell me, tell me." "Let go my hands, then." He let them go. They turned back to the fireplace. Anne shivered. She held herself to the warmth. "You haven't told me," he said. "No, I haven't told you," she repeated, stupidly. "That's because you would. That's because you love me. You do love me." "I've always loved you." She spoke as if from some far off place, as if the eternity of her love removed her from him, put her beyond his reach. "But what's the good of talking about it?" she said. "All the good in the world. We owed each other the truth. We know it now. We know where we are. We needn't humbug ourselves and each other any more. You see what comes of keeping back the truth. Look how we've had to pay for it. You and me. Would you rather go on thinking I didn't care for you?" "No, Jerrold, no. I'm only wondering what we're to do next." "Next?" "Yes. That's why you want me to go away." "It isn't. It's why I want you to stay. I want you to leave off working and do all the jolly things we used to do." "You mustn't make me leave off working. It's my only chance." They turned restlessly from the fireplace to the couch. They sat one at each end of it, still for a long time, without speaking. The fire died down. The evening darkened in the rain. The twilight came between them, poignant and disquieting, dimming their faces, making them strange and wonderful to each other. Their bodies loomed up through it, wonderful and strange. The high white stone chimney piece glimmered like an arch into some inner place. Outside, from the church below the farmhouse, the bell tinkled for service. It ceased. Suddenly they rose, and he came towards her to take her in his arms. She beat down his hands and hung on them, keeping him off. "Don't, Jerry. Please. Please don't hold me." "Oh, Anne, let me. You let me once. Don't you remember?" "We can't now. We mustn't." And yet she knew that it would happen in some time, in some way. But not now. Not like this. "We mustn't." "Don't you want me to take you in my arms?" "No. "Not that." "What then?" He pressed tighter. "I want you not to hurt Maisie." "It's too late to think of Maisie now." "I'm not thinking of her. I'm thinking of you. You'll hurt yourself frightfully if you hurt her." She wrenched his hands apart and went from him to the door. "What are you going to do?" he said. "I'm going to fetch the lamp." She left him standing there. A few minutes later she came back, carrying the lighted lamp. He took it from her and set it on the table. "And now?" "Now you're going back to Colin. And we're both going to be good. You do want to be good, don't you?" "Yes. But I don't see how we're going to manage it." "We could manage it if we didn't see each other. If I went away." "Anne, you wouldn't. You can't mean that. I couldn't stand not seeing you. You couldn't stand it either." "I have stood it. I can stand it again." "You can't. Not now. It's all different. I swear I'll be decent. I won't say another word if only you won't go." "I don't see how I can very well. There's the land." "No, Colin must look after that. I'll go when the ploughing's done. And some day you'll be glad I went. Go. Go. You'll find out then." Their tenderness was over. Something hard and defiant had come into them with the light. He was at the door now. "And you'll come back," he said. "You'll see, you'll come back." End of Part 12. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 13 of Anne Severn and the Fieldings by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 13. Anne and Jerrold. Chapter 1. When he was gone she turned on herself in fury. What had she done it for? Why had she let him go? She didn't want to be good. She wanted nothing in the world but Jerrold. She hadn't done it for Maisie. Maisie was nothing to her. A woman she had never seen and didn't want to see. She knew nothing of her but her name, and that was sweet and vague, like a perfume coming from some place unknown. She had no sweet image of Maisie in her mind. Maisie might never have existed for all that Anne thought about her. What did she do it for, then? Why didn't she take him when he gave himself, when she knew that in the end it must come to that? As far as she could see through her darkness, it was because she knew that Jerrold had not meant to give himself when he came to her. She had driven him to it. She had made him betray his secret when she asked for the truth. At that moment she was the stronger. She had him at a disadvantage. She couldn't take him like that, through the sudden movement of his weakness. Before she surrendered she must know first whether Jerrold's passion for her was his weakness or his strength. Jerrold didn't know yet. She must give him time to find out. But before all she had been afraid that if Jerrold hurt Maisie he would hurt himself. She must know which was going to hurt him more, her refusal or her surrender. If he wanted to be good she must go away and give him his chance. And before the ploughing was all over she had gone. She went down into Essex to see how her own farm was getting on. The tenant who had the house wanted to buy it when his 3 years' lease was up. Anne had decided that she would let him. The lease would be up in June. Her agent advised her to sell what was left of the farmland for building, which was what Anne had meant to do. She wanted to get rid of the whole place and be free. All this had to be looked into. She had not been gone from Jerrold a week before the torture of separation became unbearable. She had said that she could bear it because she had borne it before, but, as Jerrold had pointed out to her, it wasn't the same thing now. There was all the difference in the world between Jerrold's going away from her because he didn't want her, and her going away from Jerrold because he did. It was the difference between putting up with a dull, continuous pain you had to bear, and enduring a sharp agony you could end at any minute. Before, she had only given up what she couldn't get. Now, she was giving up what she could have tomorrow by simply going back to Wyck. She loathed the flat Essex country and the streets of little white rough cast and red tiled houses on the Ilford side where the clear fields had once lain beyond the tall elm rows. She was haunted by the steep many colored pattern of the hills round Wyck and the gray gables of the Manor. Love sickness and homesickness tore at her together till her heart felt as if it were stretched out to breaking point. She had only to go back and she would end this pain. Then on the sixth day Jerrold's wire came. "Colin ill again. Please come back. Jerrold." II. It was not her fault and it was not Jerrold's. The thing had been taken out of their hands. She had not meant to go, and Jerrold had not meant to send for her. Colin must have made him. They had lost each other through Colin, and now it was Colin who had brought them together. Colin's terror had come again. Again he had the haunting fear of the tremendous rushing noise, the crash always about to come that never came. He slept in brief fits and woke screaming. Eliot had been down to see him and had gone. And again, as before, nobody could do anything with him but Anne. "I couldn't," Jerrold said. "And Eliot couldn't. Eliot made me send for you." They had left Colin upstairs and were together in the drawing room. He stood in the full wash of the sunlight that flooded in through the west window. It showed his face drawn and haggard and discoloured as though he had come through a long illness. His mouth was hard with pain. He stared away from her with heavy, wounded eyes. She looked at him and was frightened. "Jerrold, have you been ill?" "No. What makes you think so?" "You look ill. You look as if you hadn't slept for ages." "I haven't. I've been frightfully worried about Colin." "Have you any idea what set him off again?" "I believe it was those infernal tractors. He would go out with them after you'd left. He said he'd have to as long as you weren't there, and he couldn't stand the row. Eliot said it would be that. And the responsibility, the feeling that everything depended on him." "I see. I oughtn't to have left him." "Well, it looks like it." "What else did Eliot say?" "Oh, he thinks perhaps he might be better at the farm than up here. He thinks it's bad for him sleeping in that room where he was frightened when he was a kid. He says it all hooks on to that. What's more, he says he may go on having these relapses for years. Any noise or strain or excitement will bring them on. Do you mind his being at the farm again?" "Mind? Of course I don't. If I'm to look after him and the land, it'll be very much easier there than here." For every night at Colin's bedtime Anne came up to the Manor. She slept in the room that was to be Maisie's. When Colin screamed she went to him and sat with him till he slept again. In the morning she went back to the farm. She had been doing this for a week now, and Colin was better. But he didn't want to go back, if, he said, Jerrold didn't mind having him. Jerrold wanted to know why he didn't want to go back, and Colin told him. "Hasn't it occurred to you that I've hurt Anne enough without beginning all over again? All these damned people here think I'm her lover." "You can't help that. You're not the only one that's hurt her. We must try and make it up to her, that's all." "How are we going to do it?" "My God, I don't know. I shall begin by cutting the swine who've cut her." "That's no good. She doesn't care if they do cut her. She only cares about us. She's done everything for us, and among us all we've done nothing for her. Absolutely nothing. We can't give her anything. We haven't got anything to give her that she wants." Jerrold was silent. Presently he said, "She wants Sutton's farm. Sutton's dying. I shall give it to her when he's dead." "You think that'll make it up?" "No, Colin, I don't. Supposing we don't talk about it any more." "All right. I say, when's Maisie coming home?" "God only knows. I don't." He wondered how much Colin knew. iii February had gone. They were in the middle of March, and still Maisie had not come back. She wrote sweet little letters to him, saying she was sorry to be so long away, but her mother wanted her to stay on another week. When Jerrold wrote asking her to come back (he did this so that he might feel that he had really played the game), she answered that they wouldn't let her go till she was rested, and she wasn't quite rested yet. Jerrold mustn't imagine she was the least bit ill, only rather tired after the winter's racketing. It would be heavenly to see him again. Then, when she was rested, her mother got ill, and she had to go with her to Torquay. And at Torquay Maisie stayed on and on. And Jerrold didn't imagine she had been the least bit ill, or even very tired, or that Lady Durham was ill. He preferred to think that Maisie stayed away because she wanted to, because she cared about her people more than she cared about him. The longer she stayed, the more obstinately he thought it. Here was he, trying to play the game, trying to be decent and keep straight, and there was Maisie, leaving him alone with Anne and making it impossible for him. Anne had been at the farm a week and he had not been to see her. But Maisie's last letter made him wonder whether really he need try any more. He was ill and miserable. Why should he make himself ill and miserable for a woman who didn't care whether he was ill and miserable or not? Why shouldn't he go and see Anne? Maisie had left him to her. And on Sunday morning, suddenly, he went. There had been a sharp frost overnight. Every branch and twig, every blade of grass, every crinkle in the road was edged with a white fur of rime. It crackled under his feet. He drank down the cold, clean air like water. His whole body felt cold and clean. He was aware of its strength in the hard tension of his muscles as he walked. His own movement exhilarated and excited him. He was going to see Anne. Anne was not in the house. He went through the yards looking for her. In the stockyard he met her coming up from the sheepfold, carrying a young lamb in her arms. She smiled at him as she came. She wore her farm dress, knee breeches, and a thing like an old trench coat, and looked superb. She went bareheaded. Her black hair was brushed up from her forehead and down over her ears. The length of it rolled in on itself in a curving mass at the back. Over it the frost had raised a crisp web of hair that covered its solid smoothness like a net. Anne's head was the head of a hunting Diana. It might have fitted into the sickle moon. The lamb's queer knotted body was like a grey ligament between its hind and fore quarters. It rested on Anne's arms, the long black legs dangling. The black-faced, hammer-shaped head hung in the hollow of her elbow. "This is Colin's job," she said. "What are you doing with it?" "Taking it indoors to nurse it. It's been frozen stiff, poor darling. Do you mind looking in the barn and seeing if you can find some old sacks there?" He looked, found the sacks and carried them, following her into the kitchen. Anne fetched a piece of old blanket and wrapped the lamb up. They made a bed of the sacks before the fire and laid it on it. She warmed some milk, dipped her fingers in it, and put them into the lamb's mouth to see if it would suck. "I didn't know they'd do that," he said. "Oh, they'll suck anything. When you've had them a little time they'll climb into your lap like puppies and suck the buttons on your coat. Its mother's dead and we shall have to bring it up by hand." "I doubt if you will." "Oh, yes, I shall save it. It can suck all right. You might tell Colin about it. He looks after the sick lambs." She got up and stood looking down at the lamb tucked in its blanket, while Jerrold looked at her. When she looked down Anne's face was divinely tender, as if all the love in the world was in her heart. He loved to agony that tender, downward-looking face. She raised her eyes and saw his fixed on her, heavy and wounded, and his face strained and drawn with pain. And again she was frightened. "Jerrold, you are ill. What is it?" "Don't. They'll hear us." He glanced at the open door. "They can't. He's in church and she's upstairs in the bedrooms." "Can't you leave that animal and come somewhere where we can talk?" "Come, then." He followed her out through the hall and into the small oak panelled dining room. They sat down there in chairs that faced each other on either side of the fireplace. "What is it?" she repeated. "Have you got a pain?" "A beastly pain." "How long have you had it?" "Ever since you went away. I lied when I told you it was Colin. It isn't." "What is it then? Tell me. Tell me." "It's not seeing you. It's this insane life we're leading. It's making me ill. You don't know what it's been like, and I can't keep my promise. I love you too damnably." "Oh, Jerrold, does it hurt as much as that?" "You know how it hurts." "I don't want you to be hurt. But, darling, if you care for me like that, how could you marry Maisie?" "Because I cared for you. Because I was so mad about you that nothing mattered. I thought I might as well marry her as not." "But if you didn't care for her?" "Well, I did. I do, in a way. Maisie's awfully sweet. Besides, it wasn't that. You see, I was going out to France, and I thought I was bound to be killed. Nobody could go on having the luck I'd had. I wanted to be killed." "So you were sure it would happen. You always thought things would happen if you wanted them." "I was absolutely sure. I was never more sold in my life than when it didn't. Even then I thought it would be all right till Eliot told me. Then I knew that if I hadn't been in such a damned hurry I might have married you." "Poor Maisie." "Poor Maisie, but she doesn't know. And if she did I don't think she'd mind much. I married her because I thought she cared about me and because I thought I'd be killed before I could come back to her. But she doesn't care a damn. So you needn't bother about Maisie. And you won't go away again." "I won't go away as long as you want me." That's all right, then." He looked at his watch. "I must be off. They'll be coming out of church. I don't want them to see me here now, because I'm coming back in the evening. We shall have to be awfully careful how we see each other. I say, I may come this evening, mayn't I?" "Yes." "Same time as last Sunday? You'll be alone then?" "Yes." Her voice sounded as if it didn't belong to her, as if some other person stronger than she were answering for her. When he had gone she called after him, "Don't forget to tell Colin about the lamb." She went upstairs and slipped off her farm clothes and put on the brown silk frock she had worn when he last came to her. She looked in the glass and was glad that she was beautiful. IV. She began to count the minutes and the hours till Jerrold came. Dinner time passed. All afternoon she was restless and excited. She wandered from room to room, as if she were looking for something she couldn't find. She went to and fro between the dining room and kitchen to see how the lamb was getting on. Wrapped in its blanket, it lay asleep after its meal of milk. Its body was warm to the touch, and under its soft ribs she could feel the beating of its heart. It would live. 2:00. She took up the novel she had been reading before Jerrold had come, and tried to get back into it. 10 minutes passed. She had read through 3 pages without taking in a word. Her mind went back and back to Jerrold, to the morning of to day, to the evening of last Sunday, going over and over the things they had said to each other, seeing Jerrold again with every movement, every gesture, the sudden shining and darkening of his eyes, and his tense, drawn look of pain. How she must have hurt him. It was his looking at her like that, as if she had hurt him. Anne never could hold out against other people's unhappiness. 2:30. She kicked off her shoes, put on her thick boots and her coat, and walked 2 miles up the road towards Medlicote, for no reason but that she couldn't sit still. It was not 4:00 when she got back. She went into the kitchen and looked at the lamb again. She thought, supposing Colin comes down to see it when Jerrold's here? But he wouldn't come. Jerrold would take care of that. Or supposing the Kimbers stayed in? They wouldn't. They never did. And if they did, why not? Why shouldn't Jerrold come to see her? 4:00 struck. She had the fire lit in the big upstairs sitting room. Tea was brought to her there. Mrs. Kimber glanced at her where she lay back on the couch, her hands hanging loose in her lap. "You're tired after all your week's work, miss?" "A little." "And I dare say you miss Mr. Colin." "Yes, I miss him very much." "No doubt he'll be coming down to see the lamb." "Oh, yes, he'll want to see the lamb." "And you're sure you don't mind me and Kimber going out, miss?" "Not a bit. I'd like you to go." "It's a wonder to me," said Mrs. Kimber, "as you're not afraid to be left alone in this 'ere house. But Kimber says, Miss Anne, she isn't afraid of nothin'. And I don't suppose you are, what with going out to the war and all." "There's not much to be afraid of here." "That there isn't. Not unless 'tis people's nasty tongues." "They don't frighten me, Mrs. Kimber." "No, miss, I should think not indeed. And no reason why they should." And Mrs. Kimber left her. A sound of pails clanking came from the yard. That was Minchin, the cowman, going from the dairy to the cowsheds. Milking time, then. It must be 4:30. 5:00, the slamming of the front door, the click of the gate, and the Kimbers' voices in the road below as they went towards Wyck. Anne was alone. Only half an hour and Jerrold would be with her. The beating of her heart was her measure of time now. What would have happened before he had gone again? She didn't know. She didn't try to know. It was enough that she knew herself and Jerrold, that she hadn't humbugged herself or him, pretending that their passion was anything but what it was. She saw it clearly in its reality. They couldn't go on as they were. In the end something must happen. They were being drawn to each other irresistibly, inevitably, nearer and nearer, and Anne knew that a moment would come when she would give herself to him. But that it would come to day or to morrow or at any foreappointed time she did not know. It would come, if it came at all, when she was not looking for it. She had no purpose in her, no will to make it come. She couldn't think. It was no use trying to. The thumping of her heart beat down her thoughts. Her brain swam in a warm darkness. Every now and then names drifted to her out of the darkness. Colin. Eliot. Maisie. Maisie. Only a name, a sound that haunted her always, like a vague, sweet perfume from an unknown place. But it forced her to think. What about Maisie? It would have been awful to take Jerrold away from Maisie if she cared for him. But she wasn't taking him away. She couldn't take away what Maisie had never had. And Maisie didn't care for Jerrold. And if she didn't care she had no right to keep him. She had nothing but her legal claim. Besides, what was done was done. The sin against Maisie had been committed already in Jerrold's heart when it turned from her. Whatever happened or didn't happen afterwards, nothing could undo that. And Maisie wouldn't suffer. She wouldn't know. Her thoughts went out again on the dark flood. She couldn't think any more. 5:30. She started up at the click of the gate. That was Jerrold. V. He came to her quickly and took her in his arms. And her brain was swamped again with the warm, heavy darkness. She could feel nothing but her pulses beating, beating against his, and the quick droning of the blood in her ears. Her head was bent to his breast. He stooped and kissed the nape of her neck, lightly, brushing the smooth, sweet, rose-leaf skin. They stood together, pressed close, closer to each other. He clasped his hands at the back of her head and drew it to him. She leaned it hard against the clasping hands, tilting it so that she saw his face, before it stooped again, closing down on hers. Their arms slackened. They came apart, drawing their hands slowly, reluctantly, down from each other's shoulders. They sat down, she on her couch and he in Colin's chair. "Is Colin coming?" she said. "No, he isn't." "Well, the lamb's better." "I never told him about the lamb. I didn't want him to come." "Is he all right?" "I left him playing." The darkness had gone from her brain and the tumult from her senses. She felt nothing but her heart straining towards him in an immense tenderness that was half pity. "Are you thinking about Colin?" he said. "No, I'm not thinking about anything but you. Now you know why I was happy looking after Colin. Why I was happy working on the land. Because he was your brother. Because it was your land. Because there wasn't anything else I could do for you." "And I've done nothing for you. I've only hurt you horribly. I've brought you nothing but trouble and danger." "I don't care." "No, but think. Anne darling, this is going to be a very risky business. Are you sure you can go through with it? Are you sure you're not afraid?" "I've never been much afraid of anything." "I ought to be afraid for you." "Don't. Don't be afraid. The more dangerous it is, the better I shall like it." "I don't know. It was bad enough in all conscience for you and Colin. It'll be worse for us if we're found out. Of course we shan't be found out, but there's always a risk. And it would be worse for you than for me, Anne." "I don't care. I want it to be. Besides, it won't. It'll be far worse for you because of Maisie. That's the only thing that makes it wrong." "Don't think about that, darling." "I don't. If it's wrong, it's wrong. I don't care how wrong it is if it makes you happy. And if God's going to punish either of us, I hope it'll be me." "God? The God doesn't exist who could punish you." "I don't care if he does punish me so long as you're let off." She came over to him and slid to the floor and crouched beside him and laid her head against his knees. She clasped his knees tight with her arms. "I don't want you to be hurt," she said. "I can't bear you to be hurt. But what can I do?" "Stay like that. Close. Don't go." She stayed, pressing her face down tighter, rubbing her cheek against his rough tweed. He put his arm round her shoulder, holding her there. His fingers stroked the back of her neck, pushed up through the fine roots of her hair, giving her the caress she loved. Her nerves thrilled with a sudden secret bliss. "Jerrold, it's heaven when you touch me." "I know. It's hell for me when I don't." "I didn't know. I didn't know. If only I'd known." "We know now." There was a long silence. Now and again she felt him stirring uneasily. Once he sighed and her heart tightened. At last he bent over her and lifted her up and set her on his knee. She lay back, gathered in his arms, with her head on his breast, satisfied, like a child. "Jerrold, do you remember how you used to hold me to keep me from falling in the goldfish pond?" "Yes." "I've loved you ever since then." "Do you remember how I kissed you when I went to school?" "Yes." "And the night that Nicky died?" "Yes." "I've been sleeping in that room because it was yours." "Have you? "Did you love me then, that night?" "Yes, but I didn't know I did. And then father's death came and stopped it." "I know. I know." "Anne, what a brute I was to you. Can you ever forgive me?" "I forgave you long ago." "Talk of punishments." "Don't talk of punishments." Presently they left off talking, and he kissed her. He kissed her again and again, with light kisses brushing her face for its sweetness, with quick, hard kisses that hurt, with slow, deep kisses that stayed where they fell, kisses remembered and unremembered, longed for, imagined and unimaginable. The church bell began ringing for service, short notes first, tinkling and tinkling, then a hurrying and scattering of sounds, sounds falling together, running into each other, covering each other, one long, throbbing and clanging sound, and then hard, slow strokes, measuring out the seconds like a clock. They waited till the bell ceased. The dusk gathered. It spread from the corners to the middle of the room. The tall white arch of the chimney piece jutted out through the dusk. Anne stirred slightly. "I say, how dark it's getting." "Yes, I like it. Don't get the lamp." They sat clinging together, waiting for the dark. The window panes were a black glimmer in the grey. He got up and drew the curtains, shutting out the black glimmer of the panes. He came to her and lifted her in his arms, and carried her to the couch and laid her on it. She shut her eyes and waited. End of Part 13. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 14 of Anne Severn and the Fieldings by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 14. Maisie. Chapter 1. He didn't know what he was going to do about Maisie. On a fine, warm day in April Maisie had come home. He had motored her up from the station, and now the door of their drawing room had closed on them, and they were alone together in there. "Oh, Jerrold, it is nice to see you again." She panted a little, a way she had when she was excited. "Awfully nice," he said, and wondered what on earth he was going to do next. He had been all right on the station platform, where their greetings had been public and perfunctory. But now he would have to do something intimate and, above all, spontaneous, not to stand there like a stick. They looked at each other and he took again the impression she had always given him, of delicate beauty and sweetness. She was tall and her neck bent slightly forward as she walked. This gave her the air of bowing prettily, of offering you something with a charming grace. Her shoulders and her hips had the same long, slenderly sloping curves. Her hair was mole brown on the top and turned back in an old-fashioned way that uncovered its hidden gold. Her face was white, the thin bluish whiteness of skim milk. Her mauve blue eyes looked larger than they were because of their dark brows and lashes, and the faint mauve smears about their lids. The line of her little slender nose went low and straight in the bridge, then curved under, delicately aquiline, its nostrils were close and clean cut. Her small, close upper lip had a flying droop, and her chin curved slightly, ever so slightly, away to her throat. When she talked, Maisie's mouth and the tip of her nose kept up the same sensitive, quivering play. But Maisie's eyes were still. They had no sparkling speech. They listened, deeply attentive to the person who was there. They took up the smile her mouth began and was too small to finish. And now, as they looked at him, he felt that he ought to take her in his arms, suddenly, at once. In another instant it would be too late, the action would have lost the grace of spontaneous impulse. He wondered how you simulated a spontaneous impulse. But Maisie made it all right for him. As he stood waiting for his impulse she came to him and laid her hands on his shoulders and kissed him gently on each cheek. Her hands slid down. They pressed hard against his arms above the elbow, as if to keep back his too passionate embrace. It was easy enough to return her kiss, to pass his arms under hers and press her slight body, gently, with his cramped hands. Did she know that his heart was not in it? No, she knew nothing. "What have you been doing with yourself?" she said. "You do look fit." "Do I? Oh, nothing much." He turned away from her sweet eyes that hurt him. At least he could bring forward a chair for her, and put cushions at her back, and pour out her tea and wait on her. He tried by a number of careful, deliberate attentions to make up for his utter lack of spontaneity. And she sat there drinking her tea, contented, pleased to be back in her happy home, serenely unaware that anything was missing. He took her over the house and showed her her room, the long room with the 2 south windows, one on each side of the square, cross-lighted bay above the porch. It was full of the clear April light. Maisie looked round, taking it all in, the privet white panels, the lovely faded Persian rugs, the curtains of old rose damask. An armchair and a round table with a bowl of pink tulips on it stood in the center of the bay. "Is this mine, this heavenly room?" "I thought so." He was glad that he had something beautiful to give her, to make up. She glanced at the inner door leading to his father's room. "Is that yours in there?" "Mine? No. That door's locked. I'm on the other side next to Colin." "Show me." He took her into the gallery and showed her. "It's that door over there at the end." "What a long way off," she said. "Why? You're not afraid, are you?" "Dear me, no. Could anybody be afraid here?" "Poor Colin's pretty jumpy still. That's why I have to be near him." "I see. You won't mind having him with us, will you?" "I shall love having him. Always. I hope he won't mind me." "He'll adore you, of course." "Now show me the garden." They went out to the green terraces where the peacocks spread their great tails of yew. Maisie loved the peacocks and the clipped yew walls and the goldfish pond and the flower garden. He walked quickly, afraid to linger, afraid of having to talk to her. He felt as if the least thing she said would be charged with some unendurable emotion, and that at any minute he might be called on to respond. To be sure, this was not like what he knew of Maisie, but, everything having changed for him, he felt that at any minute Maisie might begin to be unlike herself. She was out of breath. She put her hand on his arm. "Don't go so fast, Jerry. I want to look and look." They went up onto the west terrace and stood there looking. Brown crimson velvet wallflowers grew in a thick hedge under the terrace wall. Their hot sweet smell came up to them. "It's too beautiful for words," she said. "I'm glad you like it. It is rather a jolly old place." "It's the most adorable place I've ever been in. It looks so good and happy. As if everybody who ever lived in it had been good and happy." "I don't know about that. It was a hospital for 4 years. And it hasn't quite recovered yet. It's all a bit worn and shabby, I'm afraid." "I don't care. I love its shabbiness. I don't want to forget what it's been. To think that I've missed 7 weeks of it." "You haven't missed much. We've had beastly weather all March." "I've missed you. 7 weeks of you." "I think you'll get over that," he said, perversely. "I shan't. It's left a horrid empty space. But I couldn't help it. I really couldn't, Jerry." "All right, Maisie. I'm sure you couldn't." "Torquay was simply horrible. And this is heaven. Oh, Jerry dear, I'm going to be so awfully happy." He looked at her with a sudden tenderness of pity. She was visibly happy. He remembered that her charm for him had been her habit of enjoyment, and as he looked at her he saw nothing but sadness in her happiness and in her sweetness and her beauty. But the sadness was not in her, it was in his own soul. Women like Maisie were made for men to be faithful to them, and he had not been faithful to her. She was made for love, and he had not loved her. She was nothing to him. Looking at her he was filled with pity for the beauty and sweetness that were nothing to him. And in that pity and that sadness he felt for the first time the uneasy stirring of his soul. If only he could have broken the physical tie that had bound him to her until now. If only they could give it all up and fall back on some innocent, immaterial relationship that meant no unfaithfulness to Anne. When he thought of Anne he didn't know for the life of him how he was going through with it. II. Maisie had been talking to him for some seconds before he understood. At last he saw that, for reasons which she was unable to make clear to him, she was letting him off. He wouldn't have to go through with it. As Jerrold's mind never foresaw anything he didn't want to see, so in this matter of Maisie he had had no plan. Not that he trusted to the inspiration of the moment. In its very nature the moment wouldn't have been an inspiration. He had simply refused to think about it at all. It was too unpleasant. But Maisie's presence forced the problem on him with some violence. He had given himself to Anne without a scruple, but when it came to giving himself to Maisie his conscience developed a sudden sense of guiltiness. For Jerrold was essentially faithful, only his fidelity was all for Anne. His marrying Maisie had been a sin against Anne, its sinfulness disguised because he had had no pleasure in it. The thought of going back to Maisie after Anne revolted him. The thought of Anne having to share him with Maisie revolted him. Nobody, he said to himself, was ever less polygamous than he. At the same time he was sorry for Maisie. He didn't want her to suffer, and if she was not to suffer she must not know, and if she was not to know they must go on as they had begun. He was haunted by the fear of Maisie's knowing and suffering. The pity he felt for her was poignant and accusing, as if somehow she did know and suffer. She must at least be aware that something was wanting. He would have to make up to her somehow for what she had missed. He would have to give her all the other things she wanted for that one thing. Maisie's coldness might have made it easy for him. Nothing could move Jerrold from his conviction that Maisie was cold, that she was incapable of caring for him as Anne cared. His peace of mind and the freedom of his conscience depended on this belief. But in spite of her coldness, Maisie wanted children. He knew that. According to Jerrold's code, Maisie's children would be an injury to Anne, a perpetual insult. But Anne would forgive him. She would understand. She wouldn't want to hurt Maisie. So he went through with it. And now he made out that mercifully, incredibly, he was being let off. He wouldn't have to go on. He stood by Maisie's bed, looking down at her as she lay there. She had grasped his hands by the wrists as if to hold back their possible caress. And her little breathless voice went on, catching itself up and tripping. "You won't mind if I don't let you come to me?" "I'm sorry, Maisie. I didn't know you felt like that about it." "I don't. It isn't because I don't love you. It's just my silly nerves. I get frightened." "I know. I know. It'll be all right. I won't bother you." "Mother said I oughtn't to ask you. She said you wouldn't understand and it would be too hard for you. Will it?" "No, of course it won't. I understand perfectly." He tried to sound like one affectionately resigned, decently renouncing, not as though he felt this blessedness of relief, absolved from dread, mercifully and incredibly let off. But Maisie's sweetness hated to refuse and frustrate. It couldn't bear to hurt him. She held him tighter. "Jerrold, if it is, if you can't stand it, you mustn't mind about me. You must forget I ever said anything. It's nothing but nerves." "I shall be all right. Don't worry." "You are a darling." Her grasp slackened. "Please, please go. At once. Quick." As he went she put her hand to her heart. She could feel the pain coming. It filled her with an indescribable dread. Every time it came she thought she should die of it. If only she didn't get so excited. Excitement always brought it on. She held her breath tight to keep it back. Ah, it had come. Splinters of glass, sharp splinters of glass, first pricking, then piercing, then tearing her heart. Her heart closed down on the splinters of glass, cutting itself at every beat. She looked under the pillow for the little silver box that held her pearls of nitrate of amyl. She always had it with her, ready. She crushed a pearl in her pocket handkerchief and held it to her nostrils. The pain left her. She lay still. III. And every Sunday at 6 in the evening, or 9 (he varied the hour to escape suspicion), Jerrold came to Anne. In the weeks before Maisie's coming and after, Anne's happiness was perfect, intense, and secret, like the bliss of a saint in ecstasy, of genius contemplating its finished work. In giving herself to Jerrold she had found reality. She gave herself without shame and without remorse or any fear of the dangerous risks they ran. Their passion was too clean for fear or remorse or shame. She thought love was a finer thing going free and in danger than sheltered and safe and bound. The game of love should be played with a high, defiant courage. You were not fit to play it if you fretted and cowered. Both she and Jerrold came to it with an extreme simplicity, taking it for granted. They never vowed or protested or swore not to go back on it or on each other. It was inconceivable that they should go back on it. And as Anne saw no beginning to it, she saw no end. All her past was in her love for Jerrold. There never had been a time when she had ceased to love him. This moment when they embraced was only the meeting point between what had been and what would be. Nothing could have disturbed Anne's conscience but the sense that Jerrold didn't belong to her, that he had no right to love her. And she had never had that sense. They had belonged to each other always, from the time when they were children playing together. Maisie was the intruder, who had no right, who had taken what didn't belong to her. And Anne could have forgiven even that if Maisie had had the excuse of a great passion. But Maisie didn't care. So Anne, unlike Jerrold, was not troubled by thinking about Maisie. She had never seen Jerrold's wife. She didn't want to see her. So long as she didn't see her, it was as if Maisie were not there. And yet she was there. Next to Jerrold she was more there for Anne than the people she saw every day. Maisie's presence made itself felt in all the risks they ran. She was the hindrance, not to perfect bliss, but to a continuous happiness. She was the reason why they could only meet at intervals for one difficult and dangerous hour. Because of Maisie, Jerrold, instead of behaving like himself, with a reckless disregard of consequences, had to think out the least revolting ways by which they might evade them. He had to set up some sort of screen for his Sunday visits to the Manor Farm. Thus he made a habit of long walks after dark on week days and of unpunctuality at meals. To avoid being seen by the cottagers, he approached the house from behind, by the bridge over the mill water and through the orchard to the back door. Luckily the estate provided him with an irreproachable and permanent pretext for seeing Anne. For Jerrold, going about with Anne over the Manor Farm, had conceived a profound passion for his 700 acres. At last he had come into his inheritance. And if it was Anne Severn who showed him how to use it, so that he could never separate his love of it from his love of her, the land had an interest of its own that soon excited and absorbed him. He determined to take up farming seriously and look after his estate himself when Anne had Sutton's farm. Anne would teach him all she knew, and he could finish up with a year or two at the Agricultural College in Cirencester. He had found the work he most wanted to do, the work he believed he could do best. All the better if it brought him every day this irreproachable companionship with Anne. His conscience was appeased by Maisie's coldness. And Jerrold told himself that the life he led now was the best possible life for a sane man. His mind was clear and keen. His body was splendidly fit. His love for Anne was perfect. His companionship with her was perfect. Their understanding of each other was perfect. They would never be tired of each other and never bored. He rode with her over the hills and tramped with her through the furrows in all weathers. At times he would approach her through some sense, sharper than sight or touch, that gave him her inmost immaterial essence. She would be sitting quietly in a room or standing in a field, when suddenly he would be thus aware of her. These moments had a reality and certainty more poignant even than the moment of his passion. At last they ceased to think about their danger. They felt, ironically, that they were protected by the legend that made Anne and Colin lovers. In the eyes of the Kimbers and Nanny Sutton and the Vicar's wife and the Corbetts and Hawtreys and Markhams, Jerrold was the stern guardian of his brother's morals. They were saying now that Captain Fielding had put a stop to the whole disgraceful affair. He had forced Colin to leave the Manor Farm house, and he had taken over the estate in order to keep an eye on his brother and Anne Severn. Anne was not concerned with what they said. She felt that Jerrold and she were safe so long as she didn't know Maisie. It never struck her that Maisie would want to know her, since nobody else did. IV. But Maisie did want to know Anne, and for that reason. One day she came to Jerrold with the visiting cards. "The Corbetts and Hawtreys have called. Shall I like them?" "I don't know. I won't have anything to do with them." "Why not?" "Because of the beastly way they've behaved to Anne Severn." "What have they done?" "Done? They've been perfect swine. They've cut her for 5 years because she looked after Colin." "They've said the filthiest things about her." "What sort of things?" "Why, that Colin was her lover." "Oh, Jerrold, how abominable. Just because she was a saint." "Anne wouldn't care what anybody said about her. My mother left her all by herself here to take care of him, and she wouldn't leave him. She thought of nothing but him." "She must be a perfect angel." "She is. But what about these horrible people? What do you want me to do?" "Do what you like." "I don't want to know them. I'm thinking what would be best for Anne." "You needn't worry about Anne. It isn't as if she was your friend." "But she is, if she's yours and Colin's. I mean, I want her to be. I think I'd better call on these Corbett and Hawtrey people and just show them how we care about her. Then cut them dead, afterwards, if they aren't decent to her. It'll be far more telling than if I began by being rude. Only, Jerrold, how absurd. I don't know Anne. She hasn't called yet." "Well, she probably thinks you wouldn't want to know her." "Do you mean because of what they've said? That's the very reason. Why, she's the only person here I do want to know. I think I fell in love with the sound of her when you first told me about her and how she took care of Colin. We must do everything we can to make up. We must have her here a lot and give her a jolly time." He looked at her. "Maisie, you really are rather a darling." "I'm not. But I think Anne Severn must be. Shall I go and see her, or will you bring her?" "I think perhaps I'd better bring her first." He spoke slowly, considering it. Tomorrow was Sunday. He would bring her to tea, and in the evening he would walk back with her. On Sunday afternoon he went down to the Manor Farm. He found Anne upstairs in the big sitting room. "Oh, Jerrold darling, I didn't think you'd come so soon." "Maisie sent me." "Maisie?" For the first time in his knowledge of her Anne looked frightened. "Yes, she wants to know you. I'm to bring you to tea." "But it's impossible. I can't know her. I don't want to. Can't you see how impossible it is?" "No, I can't. It's perfectly natural. She's heard a lot about you." "I've no doubt she has. Jerrold, do you think she guesses?" "About you and me? Never. It's the last thing she'd think of. She's absolutely guileless." "Well, that makes it worse." "You don't know," he said, "how she feels about you. She's furious with these brutes here because they've cut you. She says she'll cut them if they won't be decent to you." "Oh, worse and worse." "You're afraid of her?" "I didn't know I was, but I am. Horribly afraid." "Really, Anne dear, there's nothing to be afraid of. She's not a bit dangerous." "Don't you see that that makes her dangerous, her not being? You've told me 100 times how sweet she is. Well, I don't want to see how sweet she is." "Her sweetness doesn't matter." "It matters to me. If I once see her, Jerrold, nothing'll ever be the same again." "Darling, really, it's the only thing you can do. Think. If you don't, can't you see how it'll give the show away? She'd wonder what on earth you meant by it. We've got to behave as if nothing had happened. This isn't behaving as if nothing had happened, is it?" "No. You see, it has happened. Oh, Jerrold, I wouldn't mind if only we could be straight about it. But it'll mean lying and lying, and I can't bear it. I'd rather go out and tell everybody and face the music." "So would I. But we can't. Look here, Anne. We don't care a damn what people think. You wouldn't care if we were found out to morrow." "I wouldn't. It would be the best thing that could happen to us." "To us, yes. If Maisie divorced me. Then we could marry. It would be all right for us. Not for Maisie. You do care about hurting Maisie, don't you?" "Yes. I couldn't bear her to be hurt. If only I needn't see her." "Darling, you must see her. You can't not. I want you to." "Well, if you want it so awfully, I will. But I tell you it won't be the same thing afterwards, ever." "I shall be the same, Anne. And you." "Me? I wonder." He rose, smiling down at her. "Come," he said. "Don't let's be late." She went. V. In the garden with Maisie, the long, innocent conversation coming back and back, Maisie's sweetness haunting her, known now and remembered. Maisie walking in the garden among the wallflowers and tulips, between the clipped walls of yew, showing Anne her flowers. She stooped to lift their faces, to caress them with her little thin white fingers. "I don't know why I'm showing you round," she said. "You know it all so much better than I do." "Oh, well, I used to come here a lot when I was little. I sort of lived here." Maisie's eyes listened, utterly attentive. "You knew Jerrold then when he was little, too?" "Yes. He was 8 when I was 5." "Do you remember what he was like?" "Yes." Maisie waited to see whether Anne were going on or not, but as Anne stopped dead she went on herself. "I wish I'd known Jerry all the time like that. I wish I remembered running about and playing with him. You were Jerrold's friend, weren't you?" "And Eliot's and Colin's." The lying had begun, falsehood by implication, and to this creature of palpable truth. "Somehow I've always thought of you as Jerrold's most. That's what makes me feel as if you were mine, as if I'd known you quite a long time. You see, he's told me things about you." "Has he?" Anne's voice was as dull and flat as she could make it. If only Maisie would leave off talking about Jerrold, making her lie. "I've wanted to know you more than anybody I've ever heard of. There are heaps of things I want to say to you." She stooped to pick the last tulip of the bunch she was gathering for Anne. "I think it was perfectly splendid of you the way you looked after Colin. And the way you've looked after Jerry's land for him." "That was nothing. I was very glad to do it for Jerrold, but it was my job anyway." "Well, you've saved Colin. And you've saved the land. What's more, I believe you've saved Jerrold." "How do you mean, saved him? I didn't know he wanted saving." "Oh, he did, rather. I mean you've made him care about the estate. He didn't care a rap about it till he came down here this time. You've found his job for him." "He'd have found it himself all right without me." "I'm not so sure. We were awfully worried about him after the war. He was all at a loose end, without anything to do, and dreadfully restless. We thought he'd never settle to anything again. And I was afraid he'd want to live in London." "I don't think he'd ever do that." "Well, he won't now. But you see, he used to be afraid of this place." "I know. After his father's death." "And he simply loves it now. I think it's because he's seen what you've done with it. I know he hadn't the smallest idea of farming it before. It's what he ought to have been doing all his life. And when you think how seedy he was when he came down here, and how fit he is now." "I think," Anne said, "I'd better be going." Maisie's innocence was more than she could bear. "Jerry will see you home. And you'll come again, won't you? Soon. Will you take them? I gathered them for you." "Thanks. Thanks awfully." Anne's voice came with a jerk. Her breath choked her. Jerrold was coming down the garden walk, looking for her. She said good bye to Maisie and turned to go with him home. "Well," he said, "how did you and Maisie get on?" "It was exactly what I thought it would be, only worse." He laughed. "Worse?" "I mean she was sweeter. Jerrold, she makes me feel such a brute. Such an awful brute. And if she ever knows " "She won't know." When he had left her, Anne flung herself down on the couch and cried. All evening Maisie's tulips stood up in the blue and white Chinese bowl on the table. They had childlike, innocent faces that reproached her. Nothing would ever be the same again. End of Chapter 14. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 15, Chapters 1 through 3 of Anne Severn and the Fieldings by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 15. Anne, Jerrold, and Maisie. Chapter 1. It was a Sunday in the middle of April. Jerrold had motored up to London on the Friday and had brought Eliot back with him for the week end. Anne had come over as she always did on a Sunday afternoon. She and Maisie were sitting out on the terrace when Eliot came to them, walking with a tired limp that Anne found piteous and adorable. Very soon Maisie murmured some gentle, unintelligible excuse and left them. There was a moment of silence in which everything they had ever said to each other was present to them, making all other speech unnecessary, as if they held a long, intimate conversation. Eliot sat very still, not looking at her, yet attentive, as if he listened to the passing of those unuttered words. Then Anne spoke and her voice broke up his mood. "What are you doing now? Bacteriology?" "Yes. We found the thing we were looking for, the germ of trench fever." "You mean you have?" "Well, somebody would have spotted it if I hadn't. A lot of us were out for it." "Oh, Eliot, I am so glad. That means you'll stamp out the disease, doesn't it?" "Probably. In time." "I knew you'd do it. I knew you'd do something big before you'd finished." "My dear, I've only just begun. But there's nothing big about it but the research, and we were all in on that. All looking for the same thing. Happening to spot it is just heaven's own luck." "But aren't you glad it was you?" "It doesn't matter who it is. But I suppose I'm glad. It's the sort of thing I wanted to do, and it's rather more important than most things one does." He said no more. Years ago, when he had done nothing, he had talked excitedly and arrogantly about his work. Now that he had done what he had set out to do, he was reserved, impassive, and very humble. "Do Jerrold and Colin know?" she said. "Not yet. You're the first." "Dear Eliot, you did know I'd be glad." "It's nice of you to care." Of course she cared. She was glad to think that he had that supreme satisfaction to make up for the cruelty of her refusal to care more. Perhaps, she thought, he wouldn't have had it if he had had her. He would have been torn in two. He would have had to give himself twice over. She felt that he didn't love her more than he loved his science, and science exacted an uninterrupted and undivided service. One life hadn't room enough for two such loves, and he might not have done so much if she had been there, calling back his thoughts, drawing his passion to herself. "What are you going to do next?" she said. "Next I'm going off for a month's holiday. To Sicily, Taormina. I've been overworking and I'm a bit run down. How about Colin?" "Oh, he's better. Heaps better. He soon got over that relapse he had when I was away in February." "You mean he got over it when you came back?" "Well, yes, it was when I came back. That's just what I don't like about him, Eliot. He's getting dependent on me, and it's bad for him. I wish he could go away somewhere for a change. A long change. Away from me, away from the farm, away from Wyck. Somewhere where he hasn't been before. It might cure him, mightn't it?" "Yes," he said. "Yes, it would be worth trying." He didn't look at her. He knew what she was going to say, and she said it. "Eliot, do you think you could take him with you? Could you stand the strain?" "If you could stand it for 4 years, I ought to be able to stand it for a month." "If he gets better it won't be a strain. He isn't a bit of trouble when he's well. He's adorable. Only perhaps if you're run down you oughtn't to." "I'm not so bad as all that. The only thing is, you say he ought to get away from you, and I wanted you to come too." "Me?" "You and Maisie and Jerrold." "I can't. It's impossible. I can't leave the farm." "My dear girl, you mustn't be tied to it like that. Don't you ever get away?" "Not unless Jerrold or Colin are here. We can't all three be away at once. But it's awfully nice of you to think of it." "I didn't. It was Maisie." Maisie? Would she never get away from Maisie, and Maisie's sweetness and kindness breaking her down? "She'll be awfully disappointed if you don't go." "Why should she be?" "Because she wants you to." "Maisie?" "Yes. Surely you know she likes you." "I was afraid she was beginning to." "Why? Don't you want her to like you? Don't you like her?" "Yes. And I don't want to like her. If I once begin I shall end by loving her." "My dear, it would be the best thing you could do." "No, Eliot, it wouldn't. You don't know." Here she is. Maisie came to them along the terrace. She moved with an unresisting grace, a delicate bowing of her head and swaying of her body, and breathless as if she went against a wind. Eliot gave up his chair and limped away from them. "Has he told you about Taormina?" she said. "Yes. It's sweet of you to ask me to go with you." "You're coming, aren't you?" "I'm afraid I can't." "Why ever not?" "I can't leave the land, for one thing. Not if Jerrold and Colin aren't here." "Oh, bother the old land. You must leave it. It can get on without you for a month or two. Nothing much can happen in that time." "Oh, can't it? Things can happen in a day if you aren't there to see that they don't." "Well, Jerrold won't mind much if they do. But he'll mind awfully if you don't come. So shall I. Besides, it's all settled. He's to come back with Eliot in time for the hay harvest, and you and I and Colin are to go on to the Italian lakes. My father and mother are joining us at Como in June. We shall be there a month and come home through Switzerland." "It would be heavenly, but I can't do it. I can't, really, Maisie." She was thinking: he'll be back for the hay harvest. "But you must. You can't go and spoil all our pleasure like that, Jerrold's and Eliot's and Colin's. And mine. I never dreamed of your not coming." "Do you mean you really want me?" "Of course I want you. So does Jerrold. It won't be the same thing at all without you. I want to see you enjoying yourself for once. You do it so well. I believe I want to see that more than Taormina and the Italian lakes. Do say you'll come." "Maisie, why are you such an angel to me?" "I'm not. I want you to come because because I want you. Because I like you. I'm happy when you're there. So's Jerrold. Don't go and say you care more for the land than Jerrold and me." "I don't. It isn't the land altogether. It's Colin. I want him to get away from me for a time and do without me. It's frightfully important that he should get away." "We could send Colin to another part of the island with Eliot. Only that wouldn't be very kind to Eliot." "No. It won't do, Maisie. I'll go off somewhere when you've come back." "But that's no good to us. Jerrold will be here for the haying, if you're thinking of that." "I'm not thinking of that. I'm thinking of Colin." As she said it she knew that she was lying. Lying to Maisie, lying for the first time. That came of knowing Maisie. It came of Maisie's sweetness. She would have to lie and lie. She was not thinking of Colin now. She was thinking that if Jerrold came back for the hay harvest and Maisie went on with Colin to the Italian lakes, she would have her lover to herself. They would be alone together all June. She would lie in his arms, not for their short, reckless hour of Sunday, but night after night, from long before midnight till the dawn. For last year, when the warm weather came, Anne and Colin had slept out of doors in wooden shelters set up in the Manor fields away from the noises of the farm. A low stone wall separated Anne's field from Colin's. This year, when Jerrold came home, Colin's shelter had been moved up from the field to the Manor garden. In the summer Anne would sleep again in her shelter. The path to her field from the Manor garden lay through 3 pastures and 2 strips of fir plantation with a green drive between. Jerrold would come to her there. He would have his bed in Colin's shelter in the garden, and when the night was quiet he would get up and go down the Manor fields and through the fir plantation to her shelter at the bottom. They would lie there in each other's arms, utterly safe, hidden from passing feet and listening ears and eyes that watched behind window panes. And as she thought of his coming to her and heard her own voice lying to Maisie, the blood mounted to her face, flooding it to the roots of her hair. "I'm thinking of Colin." Her voice kept on sounding loud and dreadful in her brain, while Maisie's voice floated across it, faint, as if it came from somewhere a long way off. "You never think of yourself. You're too good for anything, Anne." She would never be safe from Maisie and Maisie's innocence, that accused, reproached and threatened her. Maisie's sweetness went through her like a thrusting sword, like a sharp poison. It had words that cut deeper than threats, reproaches, accusations. Before she had seen Maisie she had been fearless, pitiless, remorseless. Now, because of Maisie, she would never be safe from remorse and pity and fear. She recovered. She told herself that she hadn't lied, that she had been thinking of Colin, that she had thought of him first, that she had refused to go to Taormina before she knew that Jerrold was coming back for the hay harvest. She couldn't help it if she knew that now. It was not as if she had schemed for it or counted on it. She had never for one moment counted on anything or schemed. And still, as she thought of Jerrold, her heart tightened on the sharp sword thrust of remorse. Because of Maisie nothing would ever be the same again. II. In the last week of April they had gone, Jerrold and Maisie, Eliot and Colin, to Taormina. In the last week in May Jerrold and Eliot took Maisie up to Como on their way home. They found Sir Charles and Lady Durham there waiting for her. They had left Colin by himself at Taormina. From the first moment of landing Colin had fallen in love with Sicily and refused to be taken away from it. He was aware that his recovery was now in his own hands, and that he would not be free from his malady so long as he was afraid to be alone. He had got to break himself of his habit of dependence on other people. And here in Taormina he had come upon the place that he could bear to be alone in. There was freedom in his surrender to its enchantment, and in the contemplation of its beauty there was peace. And with peace and freedom he had found his indestructible self. He had come to the end of its long injury. One day, sitting out on the balcony of his hotel, he wrote to Anne: "Don't imagine because I've got well here away from you that it wasn't you who made me well. In the first place I should never have gone away if you hadn't made me go. You knew what you were about when you sent me here. I know now what Jerrold meant when he wanted to get away by himself after Father died. He said he wanted to grow a new memory. Well, that's what I've done here." It seemed to happen all at once. One day I'd left them all and gone out for a walk by myself. It came over me that between me and being well, perfectly well, there was nothing but myself. That I was really hanging on to my illness for some sort of protection that it gave me, just as I'd hung on to you. I'd been thinking about it all the time, filling my mind with my illness, hanging on to the very fear of it, to save myself, I suppose, from a worse fear, the fear of life itself. And suddenly, out there, I let go. And the beauty of the place got me. I can't describe the beauty, except that there was a lot of strong blue and yellow in it, a clear gold atmosphere, positively quivering, and streaming over everything like gold water. I seem to remember it as if I'd been here before, a long, steady memory, not just a flash. It was like finding something you'd lost, or when a musical phrase you've been looking for suddenly comes back to you. It was the most utter, indescribable peace and satisfaction. And somehow this time joined on to the times at Wyck when we were all there and happy together, and the beastly time in between slipped through. It just dropped out, as if it had never happened, and I got a sense of having done with it for ever. I can't tell you what it was like, but I think it means I'm well. And then, on the top of it all, I remembered you, Anne, and all your goodness and sweetness. I got right away from my beastly self and saw you as you are. And I knew what you'd done for me. I don't believe I ever knew, really knew, before. I had to be alone with myself before I could see it, just as I always had to be alone with my music before I could get it right. I've never thanked you properly. I can't thank you. There aren't any words to do it in. And I only know now what it's cost you. Did he know? Did he know that it had once cost her Jerrold? For instance, I know you gave up coming here with us because you thought it would be better for me without you. Colin, too, turning it in her heart. The sharp blade of remorse. Would they never have done punishing her? And then, Maisie knows what you are. She told Eliot you were the most beautiful thing, morally, she had ever known. The one person, she said, whose motives would always be clean. If he had tried, he couldn't have hit on anything that would have hurt her so. It was more than she could bear to be punished like this through the innocence of innocent people, through their kindness and affection, their belief, their incorruptible trust in her. There was nothing in the world she dreaded more than Maisie's trust. It was as if she foresaw what it would do to her, how at any minute it would beat her, it would break her down. But she was not beaten yet, not broken down. After every fit of remorse her passion asserted itself again in a superb recovery. Her motives might not be so spotless as they looked to Maisie, but her passion itself was clean as fire. Nothing, not even Maisie's innocence, Maisie's trust in her, could make her go back on it. Hard, wounding tears cut through her eyelids as she thought of Maisie, but she brushed them away and began counting the days till Jerrold should come back. iii. He came back the first week in June, in time for the hay harvest. And it happened as she had foreseen. It would have been dangerous for Jerrold to have left the house at night to go to the Manor Farm. At any moment he might have been betrayed by his own footsteps treading the passages and stairs, by the slipping of locks and bolts, the sound of the opening and shutting of doors. The servants might be awake and hear him. They might go to his room and find that he was not there. But Colin's shelter stood in a recess on the lawn, open to the fields and hidden from the house by tall hedges of yew. Nobody could see him slip out into the moonlight or the darkness. Nobody could hear the soft padding of his feet on the grass. He had only to run down the 3 fields and cross the belt of firs to come to Anne's shelter at the bottom. The blank, projecting wall of the mill hid it from the cottages and the Manor Farm house. The firs hid it from the field path. A high bank, topped by a stone wall, hid it from the road and Sutton's farm. Its 3 wooden walls held them safe. Night after night, between 11 and midnight, he came to her. Night after night she lay awake, waiting till the light rustling of the meadow grass told her he was there. On moonlit nights a quick brushing sound. In the thick blackness a sound like a slow shearing as he felt his way. The moon would show him clear as he stood in the open frame of the shelter, looking in at her. Or she would see him grey, twilit and mysterious, or looming, darker than dark, on black nights without moon or stars. They loved the clear nights when their bodies showed to each other white under the white moon. They loved the dark nights that brought them close, shutting them in, annihilating every sensation but that of his tense, hard muscles pressing down, of her body crushed and yielding, tightening and slackening in surrender, of their brains swimming in their dark ecstasy. They loved the warmth of each other's bodies in the hot, windless nights. They loved their smooth, clean coolness washed by the night wind. Nothing, not even the sweet, haunting ghost of Maisie, came between. They would fall asleep in each other's arms and lie there till dawn, till Anne woke in a sudden fright. Always she had this fear that some day they would sleep on into the morning, when the farm people would be up and about. Jerrold lay still, tired out with satisfaction, sunk under all the floors of sleep. She had to drag him up, with kisses first and light stroking, then with a strong undoing of their embrace, pushing back his heavy arms that fell again to her breast as she parted them. Then she would wrench herself loose and shake him by the shoulders till she woke him. He woke clean, with no ugly turning and yawning, but with a great stretching of his strong body and a short, sudden laugh, the laugh he had for danger. Then he would look at his wrist watch and show it her, laughing again as she saw that this time, again, they were safe. And they would lie a little while longer, looking into each other's faces for the sheer joy of looking, reckless with impunity. And he would start up suddenly with, "I say, Anne, I must clear out or we shall be caught." And they would get up. Outside the world looked young and unknown in the June dawn, in the still clear, gold crystal air, where green leaves and green grass shone with a strange hard lustre like fresh paint, and yet unearthly, uncreated, fixed in their own space and time. And she would go with him, her naked feet shining white on the queer, bright, cold green of the grass, up the field to the belt of firs that stood up, strange and eternal, under the risen sun. They parted there, holding each other for a last kiss, a last clinging, as if never in this world they would meet again. Dawn after dawn. They belonged to the dawn and the dawn light. The dawn was their day. They knew it as they knew no other time. And Anne would go back to her shelter and lie there and live through their passion again in memory till she fell asleep. And when she woke she would find the sweet, sad ghost of Maisie haunting her, coming between her and the memory of her dark ecstasy. Maisie, utterly innocent, utterly good, trusting her, sending Jerrold back to her because she trusted her. Only to think of Maisie gave her a fearful sense of insecurity. She thought, if I'd loved her I could never have done it. If I were to love her even now that would end it. We couldn't go on. She prayed God that she might not love her. By day the hard work of the farm stopped her thinking, and the next night and the next dawn brought back her safety. End of Part 15, Chapter 3. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 15, Chapters 4 through 7 of Anne Severn and the Fieldings by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 15, Anne, Jerrold, and Maisie. Chapter 4. The hay harvest was over by the last week of June, and in the first week of July Maisie had come back. Maisie or no Maisie, the work of the farm had to go on, and Anne felt more than ever that it justified her. When the day of reckoning came, if it ever did come, let her be judged by her work. Because of her love for Jerrold, here was this big estate held together and kept going. Because of his love for her, here was Jerrold, growing into a perfect farmer and a perfect landlord. Because of her, he had found the one thing he was best fitted to do. Because of him, she herself was valuable. Anne brought to her work on the land a thoroughness that aimed continually at perfection. She watched the starting of every tractor plough and driller as it broke fresh ground, to see that machines and men were working at their highest pitch of efficiency. She demanded efficiency, and on the whole she got it. She gave it by a sort of contagion. She wrung out of the land the very utmost it was capable of yielding. She saw that there was no waste of straw or hay, of grain or fertilizers, and she knew how to take risks, spending big sums on implements and stock wherever she saw a good chance of a return. Jerrold learned from her this perfection. Her work stood clear for the whole countryside to see. Nobody could say she had not done well by the land. When she first took on the Manor Farm it had stood only in the second class. In 4 years she had raised it to the first. It was now one of the best cultivated estates in the county and famous for its prize stock. Sir John Corbett of Underwoods, Mr. Hawtrey of Medlicote, and Major Markham of Wyck Wold owned to an admiration for Anne Severn's management. Her morals, they said, might be a trifle shady, but her farming was above reproach. More reluctantly they admitted that she had made something of that young rotter Colin, even while they supposed that he had been sent abroad to keep him out of Anne Severn's way. They also supposed that as soon as he could do it decently Jerrold would get rid of Anne. Then two things happened. In July Maisie Fielding came back and was seen driving about the country with Anne Severn. And in the same month old Sutton died and the Barrow Farm was let to Anne, thus establishing her permanence. Anne had refused to take it from Jerrold as his gift. He had pressed her persistently. "You might, Anne. It's the only thing I can give you. And what is it? A scrubby 200 acres." "It's a thundering lot of land, Jerrold. I can't take it." "You must. It isn't enough after all you've done for us. I'd like to give you everything I've got, Wyck Manor and the whole blessed estate to the last turnip and every cow and pig. But I can't do that. And you used to say you wanted the Barrow Farm." "I wanted to rent it, Jerry darling. I can't let you give it me." "Why not? I think it's simply beastly of you not to." At that point Maisie had passed through the room with her flowers, and he had called to her to help him. "What are you two quarreling about?" she said. "Why, I want to give her the Barrow Farm, and she won't let me." "Of course I won't let him. A whole farm. How could I?" "I think you might, Anne. It would please him no end." "She thinks," Jerrold said, "she can go on doing things for us, but we mustn't do anything for her. And I say it's beastly of her." "It is, really, Anne darling. It's selfish. He wants to give it you so awfully. He won't be happy if you won't take it." "But a farm. A whole thumping farm. It's a big house and 200 acres. How can I take a thing like that? You couldn't yourself if you were me." Maisie's little white fingers flickered over the blue delphiniums stacked in the blue and white Chinese jar. Her mauve blue eyes were smiling at Anne over the tops of the tall blue spires. "Don't you want to make him happy?" she said. "Not that way." "If it's the only way?" She passed out of the room, still smiling, to gather more flowers. They looked at each other. "Jerrold, I can't stand it when she says things like that." "No more can I. But you know she really does want you to take that farm." "Don't you see why I can't take it from you? It's because we're lovers." "I should have thought that made it easier." "It makes it impossible. I've given myself to you. I can't take anything. Besides, it would look as if I'd taken it for that." "That's an appalling idea, Anne." "It is. But it's what everybody'll think. They'll wonder what on earth you did it for. We don't want people wondering about us. If they once begin wondering they'll end by finding out." "I see. Perhaps you're right. I'm sorry." "It sticks out of us enough as it is. I can't think how Maisie doesn't see it. But she never will. She'll never believe that we "Do you want her to see it?" "No. But it hurts so, her not seeing. Jerrold, I believe that's the punishment. Maisie's trusting us. It's the worst thing she could have done to us." Then if we're punished, we're quits. Don't think of it, Anne darling. Don't let Maisie come in between us like that." He took her in his arms and kissed her, close and quick, so that no thought could come between. But Maisie's sweetness had not done its worst. She had yet to prove what she was and what she could do. V. July passed and August. The harvest was over. And in September Jerrold went up to London to stay with Eliot for the week end, and Anne stayed with Maisie, because Maisie didn't like being left in the big house by herself. Through all those weeks that was the way Maisie had her, through her need of her. And on the Thursday before Anne came, Maisie had called on Mrs. Hawtrey of Medlicote, and Mrs. Hawtrey had asked her to lunch with her on the following Monday. Maisie said she was afraid she couldn't lunch on Monday because Anne Severn would be with her, and Mrs. Hawtrey said she was very sorry, but she was afraid she couldn't ask Anne Severn. And Maisie inquired in her tender voice, "Why not?" And Mrs. Hawtrey replied, "Because, my dear, nobody here does ask Anne Severn." Maisie said again, "Why not?" Then Mrs. Hawtrey said she didn't want to go into it, the whole thing was so unpleasant, but nobody did call on Anne Severn. She was too well known. And at that Maisie rose in her fragile dignity and said that nobody knew Anne Severn so well as she and her husband did, and that there was nobody in the world so absolutely good as Anne, and that she couldn't possibly know anybody who refused to know her, and so left Mrs. Hawtrey. The evening Jerrold came home, Maisie, flushed with pleasure, entertained him with a report of the encounter. "So you've given an ultimatum to the county?" "Yes. I told you I'd cut them all if they went on cutting Anne. And now they know it." "That means that you won't know anybody, Maisie. Except for Anne and me you'll be absolutely alone here." "I don't care. I don't want anybody but you and Anne. And if I do we can ask somebody down. There are lots of amusing people who'd come. And Eliot can bring his scientific crowd. It simply means that Corbetts and Hawtreys won't be asked to meet them, that's all." She went upstairs to lie down before dinner, and presently Anne came to him in the drawing room. She was dressed in her riding coat and breeches as she had come off the land. "What do you think Maisie's done now?" he said. "I don't know. Something that'll make me feel awful, I suppose." "If you're going to take it like that I won't tell you." "Yes, tell me. Tell me. I'd rather know." He told her as Maisie had told him. "Can't you see her standing up to the whole county? Pounding them with her little hands?" His vision of the gentle thing rising up in that sudden sacred fury of protection moved him to admiring, tender laughter. It made Anne burst into tears. "Oh, Jerrold, that's the worst that's happened yet. Everybody will cut her because of me." "Bless you, she won't care. She says she doesn't care about anybody but you and me." "But that's the awful thing, her caring. That's the punishment. The punishment." Again he took her in his arms and comforted her. "What am I to do, Jerry? What am I to do?" "Go to her," he said, "and say something nice." "Go to her and take my punishment?" "Well, yes, darling, I'm afraid you've got to take it. We can't have it both ways. It wouldn't be a punishment if you weren't so sweet, if you didn't mind so. I wish to God I'd never told you." She held her head high. "I made you. I'm glad you told me." She went up to Maisie in her room. Maisie had dressed for dinner and lay on her couch, looking exquisite and fragile in a gown of thick white lace. She gave a little soft cry as Anne came to her. "Anne, you've been crying. What is it, darling?" "Nothing. Only Jerrold told me what you'd done." "Done?" "Yes, for me. Why did you do it, Maisie?" "Why? I suppose it was because I love you. It was the least I could do." She held out her hands to her. Anne knelt down, crouching on the floor beside her, with her face hidden against Maisie's body. Maisie put her arm round her. "But why are you crying about it, Anne? You never cry. I can't bear it. It's like seeing Jerrold cry." "It's because you're so good, and I'm such a brute. You don't know what a brute I am." "Oh, yes, I know." "Do you?" she said sharply. For one moment she thought that Maisie did indeed know and understand so perfectly that she forgave. This was forgiveness. "Of course I do. And so does Jerrold. He knows what a brute you are." It was not forgiveness. It was Maisie's innocence again, her trust, the punishment. Anne knelt there and took the pain of it. VI. She lay awake, alone in her shelter. She had given the excuse of a racking headache to keep Jerrold from coming to her. For that she had had to lie. But what was her whole existence but a lie? A lie told by her silence under Maisie's trust in her, by her acceptance of Maisie's friendship, by her acquiescence in Maisie's preposterous belief. Every minute that she let Maisie go on loving and trusting and believing in her, she lied. And the appalling thing was that she couldn't be alone in her lying. So long as Maisie trusted him, Jerrold lied too. Jerrold, who was truth itself. One moment she thought, "That's what I've brought him to. That's how I've dragged him down." The next she saw that reproach as the very madness of her conscience. She had not dragged Jerrold down. She had raised him to his highest intensity of loving. She had brought him out of the illusion of his life with Maisie to reality and kept him there in an immaculate faithfulness. Not even for one insane moment did Anne admit that there was anything wrong or shameful in their passion itself. It was Maisie's innocence that made them liars, Maisie's goodness that put them in the wrong and brought shame on them, her truth that falsified them. No woman less exquisite in goodness could have moved her to this incredible remorse. It took the whole of Maisie, in her unique perfection, to beat her and break her down. Her first instinct in refusing to know Maisie had been profoundly right. It was as if she had foreseen even then that knowing Maisie would mean loving her, and that loving her she would be beaten and broken down. The awful thing was that she did love Maisie, and she couldn't tell which was the worse to bear, her love for Maisie or Maisie's love for her. And who could have foreseen the pain of it? When she prayed that she might take the whole punishment, she had not reckoned on this refinement and precision of torture. God knew what he was about. With all his resources he couldn't have hit on anything more delicately calculated to hurt. Nothing less subtle would have touched her. Not discovery, not the grossness of exposure, but this intolerable security. What could discovery and exposure do but set her free in her reality? Anne would have rejoiced to see her lie go up in one purifying flame of revelation. But to go safe in her lie, hiding her reality, and yet defenseless under the sting of Maisie's loving, was more than she could bear. She had brought all her truth and all her fineness to this passion which Maisie's innocence made a sin, and she was punished where she had sinned, wounded by the subtle God in her fineness and her truth. If only Jerrold could have escaped, but he was vulnerable too. There was fineness and truth in him. To suffer really he had to be wounded in his soul. If Jerrold was hurt, then they must end it. As yet he had given no sign of feeling, but that was like him. Up to the last minute he would fight against feeling, and when it came he would refuse to own that he suffered, that there was any cause for suffering. It would be like the time when his father was dying, when he refused to see that he was dying. So he would refuse to see Maisie, and then all at once he would see her, and he would be beaten and broken down. VII. And suddenly he did see her. It was on the first Sunday after Jerrold's return. Maisie had had another of her heart attacks by herself, in her bed, the night before, and she had been lying down all day. The sun had come round on to the terrace, and she now rested there, wrapped in a fur coat and leaning back on her cushions in the garden chair. They were sitting out there, all three, Jerrold and Anne talking together, and Maisie listening with her sweet, attentive eyes. Suddenly she shut her eyes and ceased to listen. Jerrold and Anne went on talking with hushed voices, and in a little while Maisie was asleep. Her head, rising out of the brown fur, was tilted back on the cushions, showing her innocent white throat. Her white violet eyelids were shut down on her eyes, the dark lashes lying still. Her mouth, utterly innocent, was half open. Her breath came through it unevenly, in light jerks. "She's asleep, Jerrold." They sat still, making no sound. And as she looked at Maisie sleeping, tears came again into Anne's eyes. the hard tears that cut her eyelids and spilled themselves, drop by slow drop, heavily. She tried to wipe them away secretly with her hand before Jerrold saw them, but they came again and again, and he had seen. He had risen to his feet as if he would go, then checked himself and stood beside her. And together they looked on at Maisie's sleeping. They felt together the infinite anguish, the infinite pathos of her goodness and her trust. The beauty of her spirit lay bare to them in the white, tilted face, slackened and smoothed with sleep. Sleep showed them her innocence again, naked and helpless. They saw her in her poignant being, her intense reality. She was so real that in that moment nothing else mattered to them. Anne set her teeth hard to keep her mouth still. She saw Jerrold glance at her. She heard him give a soft groan of pity or of pain. Then he moved away from them and stood by the terrace wall with his back to her. She saw his clenched hands, and through his terrible, tense quietness she knew by the quivering of his shoulders that his breast heaved. Then she saw him grasp the terrace wall and grind the edge of it into the palms of his hands. That was how he had stood by his father's deathbed, gripping the foot rail. And when presently he turned and came to her, she saw the look on his face she had seen then, of young, blind agony, sharpened now with some more piercing spiritual pain. "Come," he said. "Come into the house." They went together side by side as they had gone when they were children, along the terrace and down the steps into the drive. In the shelter of the hall she gave way and cried, openly and helplessly like a child. And he put his arm round her and led her into the library, away from the place where Maisie was. They sat together on the couch, holding each other's hands, clinging together in their suffering, their memory of what Maisie had made their sin. Even so they had sat in Anne's room, on the edge of Anne's bed, when they were children, holding each other's hands, miserable and yet glad, because they were brought together, because what they had done and what they had done and borne together. And now, as then, he comforted her. "Don't cry, Anne darling. It isn't your fault. I made you." "You didn't. You didn't. I wanted you and I made you come to me. And I knew what it would be like and you didn't." "Nobody could have known. Don't go back on it." "I'm not going back on it. If only I'd never seen Maisie, then I wouldn't have cared. We could have gone on." "Do you mean we can't now?" "Yes. How can we, when she's such an angel to us and trusts us so?" "It does make it pretty beastly," he said. "It makes me feel absolutely rotten." "So it does me when I think about it." "It's knowing her, Jerry. It's having to love her and knowing that she loves me. It's knowing what she is. Why did you make me see her?" "You know why." "Yes. Because it made it safer. That's the beastliness of it. I knew how it would be. I knew she'd beat us in the end with her goodness." "Darling, it isn't your fault." "It is. It's all my fault. I'm not going back on it. I'd do it again to morrow if it weren't for Maisie. Even now I don't know whether it's right or wrong. I only know it's the most real and valuable part of me that loves you, and it's the most real and valuable part of you that loves me. And I feel somehow that that makes it right. I'd go on with it if it made you happy. But you aren't happy now." "I'm not happy because you're not. I don't mind for myself so much. Only I hate the beastly way we've got to do it. Covering it all up and pretending that we're not lovers. Deceiving her. That's what makes it all wrong. Hiding it." "I know. And I made you do that." "You didn't. We did it for Maisie. Anyhow, we must stop it. We can't go on like this any more. We must simply tell her." "Tell her?" "Yes. Tell her and get her to divorce me so that I can marry you. It's the only straight thing." "How can we? It would hurt her so awfully." "Not so much as you think. Remember, she doesn't care for me. She's not like you, Anne. She's frightfully cold." As he said it there came to her a sudden awful intimation of reality, a sense that behind all their words, all the piled up protection of their outward thinking, there hid an unknown certainty, a certainty that would wreck them if they knew it. It was safer not to know, to go on hiding behind those piled up barriers of thought. But an inward ultimate honesty drove her to her questioning. "Are you sure she's cold?" "Absolutely sure. You go on thinking all the time that she's like you, that she takes things as hard as you do. But she doesn't. She doesn't feel as you do. It won't hurt her as it would hurt you if I left you for somebody else." "But it'll hurt her." "It's better to hurt her a little now than to go on humbugging and shamming till she finds out. That would hurt her damnably. She'd hate our not being straight with her. But if we tell her the truth she'll understand. I'm certain she'll understand and she'll forgive you. She can't be hard on you for caring for me." "Even if she doesn't care?" "She cares for you," he said. She couldn't push it from her, that importunate sense of a certainty that was not his certainty. If Maisie did care for him Jerrold wouldn't see it. He never saw what he didn't want to see. "Supposing she does care all the time? How do you know she doesn't?" "I don't think I can tell you." "But I must know, Jerrold. It makes all the difference." "It makes none to me, Anne. I'd want you whether Maisie cared for me or not. But she doesn't." "If I thought she didn't, then I shouldn't mind her knowing. Why are you so certain? You might tell me." Then he told her. After all, that sense of hidden certainty was an illusion. "When was that, Jerrold?" "Oh, a night or two after she came down here in April. She didn't know, poor darling, how she let me off." "April September. And she stuck to it?" "Oh, stuck to it. Rather." "And before that?" "Before that we were all right." "And she'd been away, too." "Yes. Ages. That made it all the funnier." "I wish you'd told me before." "I wish I had, if it makes you happier." "It does. Still, we can't go on, Jerrold, till she knows." "Of course we can't. It's too awful. I'll tell her. And we'll go away somewhere while she's divorcing me, and stay away till I can marry you. It'll be all different when we've got away." "When you've told her. We ought to have told her long ago, before it happened." "Yes. But now, what the devil am I to tell her?" He saw, as if for the first time, what telling her would mean. "Tell her the truth, the whole truth." "How can I, when it's you?" "It's because it is me that you've got to tell her. If you don't, Jerrold, I'll tell her myself." "All right. I'll tell her at once and get it over. I'll tell her tonight." "No, not tonight, while she's so tired. Wait till she's rested." And Jerrold waited. End of Part 15. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 16 of Anne Severn and the Fieldings by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 16. Anne, Maisie, and Jerrold. Chapter 1. Jerrold waited, and Maisie got her truth in first. It was on the Wednesday, a fine bright day in September, and Jerrold was to have driven Maisie and Anne over to Oxford in the car. And 10 minutes before starting Maisie had declared herself too tired to go. Anne wouldn't go without her, and Jerrold, rather sulky, had set off by himself. He couldn't understand Maisie's sudden fits of fatigue when there was nothing the matter with her. He thought her capricious and hysterical. She was acquiring his mother's perverse habit of upsetting your engagements at the last moment, and lately she had been particularly tiresome about motoring. Either they were going too fast or too far, or the wind was too strong, and he would have to turn back or hold himself in and go slowly. And the next time she would refuse to go at all for fear of spoiling their pleasure. She liked it better when Anne drove her. And today Jerrold was annoyed with Maisie because of Anne. If it hadn't been for Maisie, Anne would have been with him, enjoying a day's holiday for once. Really, Maisie might have thought of Anne and Anne's pleasure. It wasn't like her not to think of other people. Yet he owned that she hadn't wanted Anne to stay with her. He could hear her pathetic voice imploring Anne to go, because Jerry won't like it if you don't. Also he knew that if Anne was determined not to do a thing, nothing you could say would make her do it. He had had time to think about it as he sat in the lounge of the hotel at Oxford, waiting for the friends who were to lunch with him. And suddenly his annoyance had turned to pity. It was no wonder if Maisie was hysterical. His life with her was all wrong, all horribly unnatural. She ought to have had children. Or he ought never to have married her. It had been all wrong from the beginning. Perhaps she had been aware that there was something missing. Perhaps not. Maisie had seemed always singularly unaware. That was because she didn't care for him. Perhaps if he had loved her passionately she would have cared more. Perhaps not. Maisie was incurably cold. She shrank from the slightest gesture of approach. She was afraid of any emotion. She was one of those unhappy women who are born with an aversion from warm contacts, who cannot give themselves. What puzzled him was the union of such a temperament with Maisie's sweetness and her charm. He had noticed that other men adored her. He knew that if it had not been for Anne he might have adored her too. And again he wondered whether it would have made any difference to Maisie if he had. He thought not. She was happy as it was, in her gentle, unexcited way. Happy and at peace. Giving happiness and peace, if peace were what you wanted. It was that happiness and peace of Maisie's that had drawn him to her when he gave Anne up 3 years ago. And again he couldn't understand this combination of hysteria and perfect peace. He couldn't understand Maisie. Perhaps, after all, she had got what she had wanted. She wouldn't have been happy and at peace if she had been married to some brute who would have had no pity, who would have insisted on his rights. Some faithful brute, or some brute no more faithful to her than he, who had been faithful only to Anne. As he thought of Anne, darkness came down over his brain. His mind struggled through it, looking for the light. The entrance of his friends cut short his struggling. II. Maisie lay on the couch in the library, and Anne sat with her. Maisie's eyes had been closed, but now they had opened, and Anne saw them looking at her and smiling. "You are a darling, Anne. But I wish you'd gone with Jerrold." "I don't. I wouldn't have liked it a bit." "He would, though." "Not when he thought of you left here all by yourself." Maisie smiled again. "Jerry doesn't think, thank goodness." "Why 'thank goodness'?" "Because I don't want him to. I don't want him to see." "To see what?" "Why, that I can't do things like other people." "Maisie, why can't you? You used to. Jerrold's told me how you used to rush about, dancing and golfing and playing tennis." "Why? Did he say anything?" "Only that you took a lot of exercise, and he thinks it's awfully bad for you knocking it all off now." "Dear old Jerry. Of course he must think it frightfully stupid. But I can't help it, Anne. I can't do things now like I used to do. I've got to be careful." "But why?" "Because there's something wrong with my heart. Jerry doesn't know it. I don't want him to know." "You don't mean seriously wrong?" "Well, not very serious. But it hurts." "Hurts?" "Yes, and the pain frightens me. Every time it comes I think I'm going to die. But I don't die." "Oh, Maisie, what sort of pain?" "A disgusting pain, Anne. As if it was full of splintered glass mixed up with bubbling blood, cutting and tearing. It grabs at you and you choke. You feel as if your face would burst. You're afraid to breathe for fear it should come again." "But Maisie, that's angina." "It isn't real angina. But it's awful all the same." "Oh, Anne, what must the real thing be like?" "Have you seen a doctor?" "Yes, 2. A man in London and a man in Torquay." "Do they say it isn't the real thing?" "Yes, it's all nerves. But it's every bit as bad as if it was real, except that I can't die of it." "Poor little Maisie, I didn't know." "Oh, I didn't mean you to know. But I had to tell somebody. It's so awful being by yourself with it and being frightened. And then I'm afraid all the time of Jerrold finding out. I'm afraid of his seeing me when it comes on." "But Maisie, darling, he ought to know. You ought to tell him." "No. I haven't told my father and mother because they'd tell him. Luckily it's only come on in the night so that he hasn't seen. But it might come on anywhere, any minute. If I'm excited or anything. That's the awful thing, Anne. I'm afraid of getting excited. I'm afraid to feel. I'm afraid of everything that makes me feel. I'm afraid of Jerrold's touching me, even of his saying something nice to me. The least thing makes my silly heart tumble about, and if it tumbles too much the pain comes. I daren't let Jerrold sleep with me." "Yet you haven't told him." "No, I daren't." "You must tell him, Maisie." "I won't. He'd mind horribly. He'd be frightened and miserable. And I can't bear him to be frightened and miserable. He's had enough. He's been through the war. I don't mean that that frightened him, but this would." "You mean to say he doesn't see it?" "Oh, bless you, no. He just thinks I'm tiresome and hysterical. I'd rather he thought that than see him unhappy. Nothing in the world matters but Jerrold. You see, I care for him so frightfully. You don't know how awful it is, caring like that, and yet having to beat him back all the time, never to give him anything. I daren't let him come near me because of that ghastly fright. I know you oughtn't to be afraid of pain, but it's a pain that makes you afraid. Being afraid's all part of it, so I can't help it." "Well, of course you can't help it." "I wouldn't mind if it wasn't for Jerry. I ought never to have married him." "But Maisie, I can't understand it. You're always so happy and calm. How can you be calm and happy with that hanging over you?" "I've got to be calm for fear of it. And I'm happy because Jerrold's there. Simply knowing that he's there. I can't think what I'd do, Anne, if he wasn't such an angel. Some men wouldn't be. They wouldn't stand it. And that makes me care all the more. He'll never know how I care." "You must tell him." "There it is. I daren't even try to tell him. I just live in perpetual funk." "And you're the bravest thing that ever lived." "Oh, I've got to cover it up. It wouldn't do to show it, but I'm glad I've told you." She leaned back, panting. "I mustn't talk any more now." "No. Rest." "You won't mind? But get a book and read. You'll be so bored." She shut her eyes. Anne got a book and tried to read it, but the words ran together, grey lines tangled on a white page. Nothing was clear to her but the fact that Maisie had told the truth about herself. It was the worst thing that had happened yet. It was the supreme reproach, the ultimate disaster and defeat. Yet Maisie had not told her anything that surprised her. This was the certainty that hid behind the defences of their thought, the certainty she had foreseen when Jerrold told her about Maisie's coldness. It meant that Jerrold couldn't escape and that his punishment would be even worse than hers. Nothing that Maisie could have done would have been more terrible to Jerrold than her illness and the way she had hidden it from him. The poor darling going in terror of it, lying in bed alone, night after night, shut in with her terror. Jerrold was utterly vulnerable. His belief in Maisie's indifference had been his only protection against remorse. How was he going to bear Maisie's wounding love? How would he take the knowledge of it? Anne saw what must come of his knowing. It would be the end of their happiness. After this they would have to give each other up. He would never take her in his arms again. He would never come to her again in the fields between midnight and dawn. They couldn't go on unless they told Maisie the truth. And they couldn't tell Maisie the truth now because the truth would bring the pain back to her poor little heart. They could never be straight with her. They would have to hide what they had done forever. Maisie had silenced them forever when she got her truth in first. To Anne it was not thinkable either that they should go on being lovers, knowing about Maisie, or that she should keep her knowledge to herself. She would tell Jerrold and end it. III. She stayed on with Maisie till the evening. Jerrold had come back and was walking home with her through the Manor fields, when she made up her mind that she would tell him now, at the next gate, the next. When they came to the belt of firs she would tell him. She stopped him there by the fence of the plantation. The darkness hid them from each other, only their faces and Anne's white coat glimmered through. "Wait a minute, Jerrold. I want to tell you something. About Maisie." He drew himself up abruptly, and she felt the sudden start and check of his hurt mind. "You haven't told her?" he said. "No. It's something she told me. She doesn't want you to know, but you've got to know it. You think she doesn't care for you, and she does. She cares awfully. But she's ill." "Ill? She isn't, Anne. She only thinks she is. I know Maisie." "You don't know that she gets heart attacks. Frightful pain, Jerrold. Pain that terrifies her." "My God, you don't mean she's got angina?" "Not the real kind. If it was that she'd be dead. But pain so bad that she thinks she's dying every time. It's what they call false angina. That's why she doesn't want you to sleep with her, for fear it'll come on and you'll see her." Through the darkness she could feel the vibration of his shock. It came to her in his stillness. "You said she didn't feel. She's afraid to feel because feeling brings it on." He spoke at last. "Why on earth couldn't she tell me that?" "Because she loves you so awfully. The poor darling didn't want you to be unhappy about her." "Oh, as if that mattered." "It matters more than anything to her." "Do you really mean she's got that hellish thing? Who told her what it was?" Some London doctor and a man at Torquay. I shall take her up to morrow and make her see a specialist. If you do, you mustn't let her know I told you, or she'll never tell me anything again." "Well, what am I to say?" "Say you've been worried about her." "God knows I ought to have been." "You're worried about her and you think there's something wrong. If she says there isn't, you'll say that that's what you want to be sure of." "Look here, how do those fellows know it isn't the real thing?" "Oh, they can tell that by the state of her heart. I don't suppose for a moment it's the real thing. She wouldn't be alive if it was. And you don't die of false angina. It's all nerves, though it hurts like sin." He was silent for a second. "Anne, she's beaten us. We can't tell her now." "No, and we can't go on. If we can't be straight about it, we've got to give each other up." "I know. We can't go on. There's nothing more to be said." His voice dropped on her aching heart with a toneless weight of finality. "We've got to end it now, this minute," she said. "Don't come any farther." "Let me go to the bottom of the field." "No, I'm not going that way." He had come close to her now, close, as though he would have taken her in his arms for the last night, the last time. He wanted to touch her, to hold her back from the swallowing darkness. But she moved out of his reach and he did not follow her. His passion was ready to flame up if he touched her, and he was afraid. They must end it clean, without a word or a touch. The grass drive between the firs led to a gate on the hill road that skirted the Manor fields. He knew that she would go from him that way, because she didn't want to pass by their shelter at the bottom. She couldn't sleep in it tonight. He stood still and watched her go, her white coat glimmering in the darkness between the black rows of firs. The white gate glimmered at the end of the drive. She stood there a moment. He saw her slip like a white ghost between the gate and the gate post. He heard the light thud of the wooden latch falling back behind her, and she was gone. End of Part 16. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 17 of Anne Severn and the Fieldings by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 17. Jerrold, Maisie, Anne and Eliot. Chapter 1. Maisie lay in bed, helpless and abandoned to her illness. It was no good trying to cover it up and hide it any more. Jerrold knew. The night when he left Anne he had gone up to Maisie in her room. He couldn't rest unless he knew that she was all right. He had stooped over her to kiss her, and she had sat up, holding her face to him, her hands clasped round his neck, drawing him close to her, when suddenly the pain gripped her and she lay back in his arms, choking, struggling for breath. Jerrold thought she was dying. He waited till the pain passed and she was quieted, then he ran downstairs and telephoned for Ransome. He looked on in agony while Ransome's stethoscope wandered over Maisie's thin breast and back. It seemed to him that Ransome was taking an unusually long time about it, that he must be on the track of some terrible discovery. And when Ransome took the tubes from his ears and said curtly, "Heart quite sound, nothing wrong there," he was convinced that Ransome was an old fool who didn't know his business. Or else he was lying for Maisie's sake. Downstairs in the library he turned on him. "Look here, there's no good lying to me. I want the truth." "My dear Fielding, I shouldn't dream of lying to you. There's nothing wrong with your wife's heart. Nothing organically wrong." "With that pain? She was in agony, Ransome. Agony. Why can't you tell me at once that it's angina?" "Because it isn't. Not the real thing. False angina's a neurosis, not a heart disease. Get the nervous condition cured and she'll be all right. Has she had any worry? Any shock?" "Not that I know." "Any cause for worry?" He hesitated. Poor Maisie had had cause enough if she had known. But she didn't know. It seemed to him that Ransome was looking at him queerly. "No," he said. "None." "You're quite certain? Has she ever had any?" "Well, I suppose she was pretty jumpy all the time I was at the front." "Before that? Years ago?" "That I don't know. I should say not." "You won't swear?" "No, I won't swear. It would be years before we were married." "Try and find out," said Ransome, "and keep her quiet and happy. She'd better stay in bed for a week or two." So Maisie stayed in bed, and Jerrold and Anne sat with her, together or in turn. He had a bed made up in her room and slept there when he slept at all. But half the night he lay awake, listening for the sound of her panting and the little gasping cry that would come when the pain got her. He kept on getting up to look at her and make sure that she was sleeping. He was changed from his old happy, careless self, the self that used to turn from any trouble, that refused to believe that the people it loved could be ill and die. He was convinced that Maisie's state was dangerous. He sent for Dr. Harper of Cheltenham, and for a nerve specialist and a heart specialist from London, and they all told him the same thing, and he wouldn't believe them. Because Maisie's death was the most unbearable thing that his remorse could imagine, he felt that nothing short of Maisie's death would appease the powers that punished him. He was the more certain that Maisie would die because he had denied that she was ill. For Jerrold's mind remembered everything and anticipated nothing. Like most men who refuse to see or foresee trouble, he was crushed by it when it came. The remorse he felt might have been less intolerable if he had been alone in it. But day after day his pain was intensified by the sight of Anne's pain. She was exquisitely vulnerable. And for every pang that stabbed her he felt himself responsible. What they had done together, and they suffered for it together, but in the beginning she had done it for him, and he had made her do it. Nobody, not even Maisie, could have been more innocent than Anne. He had no doubt that, left to herself, she would have hidden her passion from him to the end of time. He, therefore, was the cause of her suffering. It was as if Anne's consciousness were transferred to him, day after day, when they sat together in Maisie's room, one on each side of her bed, while Maisie lay between them, sleeping her helpless and reproachful sleep. And he saw Anne's piteous face, white with pain. His pity for Maisie and his pity for Anne, their pity for each other were mixed together and held them, close as passion, in an unbearable communion. They looked at each other, and their wounded eyes said, day after day, the same thing. "Yes, it hurts. But I could bear it if it were not for you." Their pity took the place of passion. It was as if a part of each other passed into them with their suffering, as it had passed into them with their joy. II. And through it all their passion itself still lived its inextinguishable and tortured life. Pity, so far from destroying it, only made it stronger, pouring in its own emotion, wave after wave, swelling the flood that carried them towards the warm darkness where will and thought would cease. And as Jerrold's soul had once stirred in the warm darkness under the first stinging of remorse, so now it pushed and struggled to be born. All his will fought against the darkness to deliver his soul. His soul knew that Anne saved it. If her will had been weaker, his would not have been so strong. At this moment an unscrupulous Anne might have damned him to the sensual hell by clinging to his pity. He would have sinned because he was sorry for her. But Anne's will refused his pity. When he showed it she was angry. Yet it was there, waiting for her always, against her will. One day in October, Maisie's illness lasting on into the autumn, they had gone out into the garden to breathe the cold, clean air while Maisie slept. "Jerrold," she said suddenly, "do you think she knows?" "No. I'm certain she doesn't." "I'm not. I've an awful feeling that she knows, and that's why she doesn't get better." "I don't think so. If she knew she'd have said something or done something." "She mightn't. She mightn't do anything. Perhaps she's just being angelically good to us." "She is angelically good. But she doesn't know. You forget her illness began before there was anything to know. It isn't the sort of thing she'd think of. If somebody told her she wouldn't believe it. She trusts us absolutely. That's bad enough, Anne, without her knowing." "Yes. It's bad enough. It's worse, really." "I know it is. Anne, I'm awfully sorry to have let you in for all this misery." "You mustn't be sorry. You haven't let me in for it. Nobody could have known it would have happened. It wouldn't if Maisie had been different. We wouldn't have bothered then. Nothing would have mattered. Think how gloriously happy we were. All my life, all my happiness has come through you or because of you. We'd be happy still if it wasn't for Maisie." "I don't see how we're to go on like this. I can't stand it when you're not happy, and nothing makes any difference really. I want you so awfully all the time." That's one of the things we mustn't say to each other." "I know we mustn't. Only I didn't want you to think I didn't." "I don't think it. I know you'll care for me as long as you live. Only you mustn't say so. You mustn't be sorry for me. It makes me feel all weak and soft when I want to be strong and hard." "You are strong, Anne." "So are you. I shouldn't love you if you weren't. But we mustn't make it too hard for each other. You know what'll happen if we do." "What? You mean we'd crumple up and give in?" "No. But we couldn't ever see each other alone again. Never see each other again at all, perhaps. I'd have to go away." "You shan't have to. I swear I won't say another word." "Sometimes I think it would be easier for you if I went." "It wouldn't. It would be simply damnable. You can't go, Anne. That would make Maisie think." iii. After weeks of rest Maisie passed into a period of painless tranquillity. She had no longer any fear of her illness because she had no longer any fear of Jerrold's knowing about it. He did know, and yet her world stood firm round her, firmer than when he had not known. For she had now, in Jerrold's ceaseless devotion, what seemed to her the absolute proof that he cared for her if she had ever doubted it. And if he had doubted her, hadn't he the absolute proof that she cared, desperately? Would she have so hidden the truth from him? Would she have borne her pain and the fear of it in that awful, lonely secrecy if she had not cared for him more than for anything on earth? She had been more afraid to sleep alone than poor Colin, who had waked them with his screaming. Jerrold knew that she was not a brave woman like Anne or Colin's wife Queenie. It was out of her love for him that she had drawn the courage that made her face, night after night, the horror of her torment alone. If he had wanted proof, what better proof could he have than that? So Maisie remained tranquil, secure in her love for Jerrold and in his love for her, while Anne and Jerrold were tortured by their love for each other. They were no longer sustained in their renunciation by the sight of Maisie's illness, and the fear of it which more than anything had held back their passion. Without that warning fear they were exposed at every turn. It might be there, waiting for them in the background, but, with Maisie going about as if nothing had happened, even remorse had lost its protective poignancy. They suffered the strain of perpetual frustration. They were never alone together now. They had passed from each other, beyond all contact of spirit with spirit and flesh with flesh, beyond all words and looks of longing. They had nothing of each other but sight, sight that had all the violence of touch without its satisfaction, that served only to excite them, to torture them with desire. They might be held at arm's length, at a room's length, at a field's length apart, but their eyes drew them together, set their hearts beating. In one moment of seeing they were joined and put asunder. And, day after day, their minds desired each other with a subtle, incessant, intensely conscious longing, and were utterly cut off from all communion. They met now at longer and longer intervals, for their work separated them. Colin had come home in October, perfectly recovered, and he and Jerrold managed the Manor estate together, while Anne looked after her own farm. Jerrold never saw her. He never tried to see her unless Colin or Maisie or some of the farm people were present. He was afraid, and Anne knew that he was afraid. Her sense of his danger made her feel herself fragile and unstable. She, too, avoided every occasion of seeing him alone. And this separation, so far from saving them, defeated its own end. Every day it brought them nearer to the breaking point. It was against all nature, and all nature was against it. They had always before them that vision of the point at which they would give in. Always there was one thought that drew them to the edge of surrender. I can bear it for myself, but I can't bear it for him. I can bear it for myself, but I can't bear it for her. And to both of them had come another fear, greater than their dread of Maisie's pain, the fear of each other's illness. Their splendid physical health was beginning to break down. They worked harder than ever on the land, but hard work exhausted them at the end of the day. They went on from a sense of duty, dull and implacable, but they had no more pleasure in it. Anne became every night more restless, every day more tired and anemic. Jerrold ate less and slept less. They grew thin, and their faces took on the same look of fatigue and anxiety and wonder, as if, more than anything, they were amazed at a world whose being connived at and tolerated their pain. Maisie saw it and felt the first vague disturbance of her peace. Her illness had worried everybody while it lasted, but she couldn't think why, when she was well again, Anne and Jerrold should go on looking like that. Maisie thought it was physical. The poor dears worked too hard. The change had been so gradual that she saw it without consternation. But when Eliot came down in November he couldn't hide his distress. To Eliot the significant thing was not Anne's illness or Jerrold's illness, but the likeness in their illnesses, the likeness in their faces. It was clear that they suffered together with the same suffering from the same cause. And when on his last evening Jerrold took him into the library to consult him about Maisie's case, Eliot had a hard, straight talk with him about his own. "My dear Jerrold," he said, "there's nothing seriously wrong with Maisie. I've examined her heart. It isn't a particularly strong heart, but there's no disease in it. If you took her to all the specialists in Europe they'd tell you the same thing." "I know, but I keep on worrying." "That, my dear chap, is because you're ill yourself. I don't like it. I'm not bothered about Maisie, but I am bothered about you and Anne." "Anne? Do you think Anne's ill?" "I think she will be, and so will you if What have you been doing?" "We've been doing nothing." "That's it. You've got to do something, and do it pretty quick, if it's to be any good." Jerrold started and looked up. He wondered whether Eliot knew. He had a way of getting at things, you couldn't tell how. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" His words came with a sudden, sharp rapidity. "You know what I mean." "I don't know how you know anything, and as a matter of fact you don't." "I don't know much. But I know enough to see that you two can't go on like this." "Maisie and me?" "No. You and Anne. It's Anne I'm talking about. I suppose you can make a mess of your own life if you like. You've no business to make a mess of hers." "My God, as if I didn't know it. What the devil am I to do?" "Leave her alone, Jerrold, if you can't have her." "Leave her alone? I am leaving her alone. I've got to leave her alone if we both die of it." "She ought to go away," Eliot said. "She can't go away unless I go with her, and I can't." "Well, then, it's an impossible situation." "It's a damnable situation, but it's the only decent one. You forget there's Maisie." "No, I don't. Maisie doesn't know?" "Oh, Lord, no. And she never will. You ought to tell her." Jerrold was silent. "My dear Jerrold, it's the only sensible thing. Tell her straight and get her to divorce you." "I was going to. Then she got ill and I couldn't." "She isn't ill now." "She will be if I tell her. It'll simply kill her." "It won't. It may, even, cure her." "It'll make her frightfully unhappy. And it'll bring back that infernal pain. If you'd seen her, Eliot, you'd know how impossible it is. We simply can't be swine. And if I could, Anne couldn't. No. We've got to stick it somehow, Anne and I." "It's all wrong, Jerrold." "I know it's all wrong, but it's the best we can do. You don't suppose Anne would be happy if we did Maisie down?" "No. No. She wouldn't. You're right there. But it's a damnable business." "Oh, damnable, yes." Jerrold laughed in his agony. Yet he saw, as if he had never seen it before, Eliot's goodness and the sadness and beauty of his love for Anne. He had borne for years what Jerrold was bearing now, and Anne had not loved him. He had never known for one moment the bliss of love or any joy. He had had nothing. And Jerrold remembered with a pang of contrition that he had never cared enough for Eliot. It had always been Colin, the young, breakable Colin, who had clung to him and followed him. Eliot had always gone his own queer way, keeping himself apart. And now Eliot was nearer to him than anything in the world except Anne. "I'm sorry, Jerrold." "You're pretty decent, Eliot, to be sorry. I believe you honestly want me to have Anne." "I wouldn't go so far as that, old man. But I believe I honestly want Anne to have you. I say, she hasn't gone yet, has she?" "No. Maisie's keeping her for dinner in your honour. You'll probably find her in the drawing room now." "Where's Maisie?" "She won't worry you. She's gone to lie down." Eliot went into the drawing room and found Anne there. She looked at him. "You've been talking to Jerrold," she said. "Yes, Anne. I'm worried about him." "So am I." "And I'm worried about you." "And he's worried about Maisie." "Yes. I suppose he began by not seeing she was ill, and now he does see it he thinks she's going to die. I've been trying to explain to him that she isn't." "Can you explain why she's got into this state? It's not as if she wasn't happy. She is happy." "Well, she wasn't always happy. Jerrold must have made her suffer damnably." "When?" "Oh, long before he married her." "But how did he make her suffer?" "Oh, by just not marrying her. She found out he didn't care for her. Her people took her out to India, I believe, with the idea that he would marry her. And when they saw that Jerry wasn't on in that act, they sent her back again. Poor Maisie got it well rammed into her then that he didn't care for her, and the idea's stuck. It's left a sort of wound in her memory." "But she must have thought he cared for her when he did marry her. She thinks he cares now." "Of course she thinks it. I don't suppose he's ever let her see." "I know he hasn't." "But the wound's there, all the same. She's never got over it, though she isn't conscious of it now. The fact remains that Maisie's marriage is incomplete because Jerry doesn't care for her. Part of Maisie, the adorable part we know, isn't aware of any incompleteness. It lives in a perpetual illusion. But the part we don't know, the hidden, secret part of her, is aware of nothing else. Well, her illness is simply camouflage for that. Maisie's mind couldn't bear the reality, so it escaped into a neurosis. Maisie's behaving as though she wasn't married, so that her mind can say to itself that her marriage is incomplete because she's ill, not because Jerry doesn't care for her. It's substituted a bearable situation for an unbearable one." "Then you don't think she knows?" "That Jerrold doesn't care for her? No. Only in that unconscious way. Her mind remembers and she doesn't." "I mean she doesn't know about Jerrold and me." "I'm sure she doesn't. If she did she'd do something." "That's what Jerrold said. What would she do?" "Oh, something beautiful, or it wouldn't be Maisie. She'd let Jerrold go." "Yes, she'd let him go, and she'd die of it." "Oh no, she wouldn't. I told Jerrold just now it might cure her." "How could it cure her?" "By making her face reality. By making her see that her illness simply means that she hasn't faced it. All our neuroses come because we daren't live with the truth." "It's no good making Maisie well if we make her unhappy. Besides, I don't believe it. If Maisie's unhappy she'll be worse, not better." "There is just that risk," he said. "But it's you I'm thinking about, not Maisie. You see, I don't know what's happened." "Jerrold didn't tell you?" "He only told me what I know already." "After all, what do you know?" "I know you were all right, you and he, when I saw you together here in the spring. So I suppose you were happy then. Jerrold looked wretchedly ill all the time he was at Taormina. So I suppose he was unhappy then because he was away from you. He looks wretchedly ill now. So do you. So I suppose you're both unhappy." "Yes, we're both unhappy." "Do you want to tell me about it, Anne?" "No, I don't want to tell you about it. Only if I thought you still wanted to marry me." "I do want to marry you. I shall always want to marry you. I told you long ago that nothing would ever make any difference." "Even if " "Even if. Whatever you did or didn't do I'd still want you. But I told you, don't you remember, that you could never do anything dishonourable or cruel. And I told you I wasn't sure. And I am sure. That's enough for me. I don't want to know anything more. I don't want to know anything you'd rather I didn't know. Oh, Eliot, you are so good. You're good like Maisie. Don't worry about Jerry and me. We'll see it through somehow. And if you can't stand the strain of it?" "But I can." "And if he can't? If you want to be safe?" "I told you I should never want to be safe." "If you want him to be safe, then, would you marry me?" "That's different. I don't know, Eliot, but I don't think so." He went away with a faint hope. She had said it would be different. What she would never do for him she might do for Jerrold. She might, after all, marry him to keep Jerrold safe. Nothing made any difference. Whatever Anne did she would still be Anne. And it was Anne he loved. And after all, what did he know about her and Jerrold? Only that if they had been lovers that would account for their strange happiness 7 months ago. If they had given each other up this would account for their unhappiness now. He thought, how they must have struggled. Perhaps some day when the whole story was told and Anne was tired of struggling, she would come to him and he would marry her. Even if. End of Part 17, recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 18 of Anne Severn and the Fieldings by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 18. Jerrold and Anne. Chapter 1. The Barrow Farm house, long, low, and grey, stood back behind the tall elms and turned its blank north gable end to the road and the Manor Farm. Its 9 mullioned windows looked down the field to the river. And the great barns were piled behind it, long roof trees, steep, mouse-coloured slopes and peaks above grey walls. Anne didn't move into the Barrow Farm house all at once. She had to wait while Jerrold had the place made beautiful for her. This was the only thing that roused him to any interest. Through all his misery he could still find pleasure in the work of throwing small rooms into one to make more space for Anne, and putting windows into the south gable to give her the sun. Anne's garden absorbed him more than his own 700 acres. Maisie and he planned it together, walking round the rank flower beds and bald wastes scratched up by the hens. There was to be a flagged court on one side and a grass plot on the other, with a flower garden between. Here, Maisie said, there should be great clumps of larkspurs, and there a lavender hedge. They said how nice it would be for Anne to watch the garden grow. "He's going to make it so beautiful that you'll want to stay in it for ever," she said. And Anne went with them and listened to them, and told them they were angels, and pretended to be excited about her house and garden, while all the time her heart ached and she was too tired to care. The house was finished by the end of November, and Jerrold and Maisie helped her to furnish it. Maisie sent to London for patterns and brought them to Anne to choose. Maisie thought perhaps the chintz with the cream and pink roses, or the one with the green leaves and red tulips and blue and purple clematis was the prettiest. Anne tried to behave as if all her happiness depended on a pattern, and ended by choosing the one that Maisie liked best. And the furniture went where Maisie thought it should go, because Anne was too tired to care. Besides, she was busy on her farm. Old Sutton in his decadence had let most of his arable land run to waste, and Anne's job was to make good soil again out of bad. Maisie was pleased like a child and excited with her planning. Her idea was that Anne should come in from her work on the land and find the house all ready for her, everything in its place, chairs and sofas dressed in their gay suits of chintz, the books on their shelves, the blue and white china in rows on the oak dresser. Tea was set out on the gate-legged table before the wide hearth-place. The lamps were lit. A big fire burned. Colin and Jerrold and Maisie were there waiting for her. And Anne came in out of the fields, tired and white and thin, her black hair drooping. Her rough land dress hung slack on her slender body. Jerrold looked at her. Anne's tired face, trying to smile, wrung his heart. So did the happiness in Maisie's eyes. And Anne's voice trying to sound as if she were happy. "You darlings, how nice you've made it." "Do you like it?" Maisie was breathless with joy. "I love it. I adore it. But aren't there lots of things that weren't here before? Where did that table come from?" "From the Manor Farm. Don't you remember it? That's Eliot." "And the bureau and the dresser and those heavenly rugs?" "That's Jerrold." "And the china was Colin and the chintz was Maisie." The long couch for Anne to lie down on was Maisie. Everything that was not Anne's they had given her. "You shouldn't have done it," she said. "We did it for ourselves, to keep you with us," said Maisie. "Did you think it would take all that?" She wondered whether they saw how hard she was trying to look happy, not to be too tired to care. Then Maisie took her upstairs to show her her bedroom and the white bathroom. Colin carried the lamp. He left them together in Anne's room. Maisie turned to her there. "Darling, how tired you look. Are you too tired to be happy?" "I'd be a brute if I weren't happy," Anne said. But she wasn't happy. The minute they were gone her sadness came upon her, crushing her down. She could hear Colin and Maisie, the two innocent ones, laughing out into the darkness. She saw again Jerrold's hard, unhappy face trying to smile, his mouth jerking in the tight, difficult smile that was like an agony. And it used to be Jerrold who was always happy, who went laughing. She turned up and down the beautiful lighted room. She looked again and again at the things they had given her, Colin and Jerrold and Maisie. Maisie. She would have to live with the cruelty of Maisie's gifts, with Maisie's wounding kindness and her innocence, Maisie's curtains, Maisie's couch, covered with flowers that smiled at her, gay on the white ground. She thought of the other house, of the curtains that had shut out the light from her and Jerrold, of the couch where she had lain in his arms. Each object had a dumb but poignant life that reminded and reproached her. This was the scene where her life was to be cast. Henceforth these things would know her in her desolation. Jerrold would never come to her here as he had come to the Manor Farm house. They would never sit together talking by this fireside. Those curtains would never be drawn on their passion. He would never go up to that lamp and put it out. She would never lie here waiting, thrilling, as he came to her through the darkness. She had wanted the Barrow Farm, and she had got what she had wanted, and she had got it too late. She loved it. Yet how was it possible to love the place that she was to be so unhappy in? She ought to hate it with its enclosing walls, its bright eyed, watching furniture, its air of quiet complicity in her pain. She drew back the curtains. The lamp and its yellow flame hung out there on the darkness of the fields. The fields dropped away through the darkness to the river, and there were the black masses of the trees. There the earth waited for her. Out there was the only life left for her to live. The life of struggling with the earth, forcing the earth to yield to her more than it had yielded to the men who had tilled it before her, making the bad land good. Ploughing time would come, and seed time, and hay harvest and corn harvest. Feeding time and milking time would come. She would go on seeing the same things done at the same hour, at the same season, day after day and year after year. There would have been joy in that if it had been Jerrold's land, if she could have gone on working for Jerrold and with Jerrold, and if she had not been so tired. She was only 29 and Jerrold was only 32. She wondered how many more ploughing times they would have to go through, how many seed times and harvests. And how would they go through them? Would they go on getting more and more tired, or would something happen? No, nothing would happen, nothing that they could bear to think of. They would just go on. In the stillness of the house she could feel her heart beating, measuring out time, measuring out her pain. II. That winter Adeline and John Severn came down to Wyck Manor for Christmas and the New Year. Adeline was sitting in the drawing room with Maisie in the heavy hour before tea time. All afternoon she had been trying to talk to Maisie, and she was now bored. Jerrold's wife had always bored her. She couldn't imagine why Jerrold had married her when it was so clear that he was not in love with her. "It's funny," she said at last, "staying in your own house when it isn't your own any more." Maisie hoped that Adeline would treat the house as if it were her own. "I probably shall. Don't be surprised if you hear me giving orders to the servants. I really cannot consider that Wilkins belongs to anybody but me." Maisie hoped that Adeline wouldn't consider that he didn't. And there was a pause. Adeline looked at the clock and saw that there was still another half hour till tea time. How could they possibly fill it in? Then suddenly, from a thought of Jerrold so incredibly married to Maisie, Adeline's mind wandered to Anne. "Is Anne dining here to night?" she said. And Maisie said yes. She thought Adeline and Mr. Severn would like to see as much as possible of Anne. And Adeline said that was very kind of Maisie, and was bored again. She saw nothing before her but more and more boredom, and the subject of Anne alone held out the prospect of relief. She flew to it as she would have fled from any danger. "By the way, Maisie, if I were you, I wouldn't let Anne see too much of Jerrold." "Why not?" "Because, my dear, it isn't good for her." "I should have thought," Maisie said, "it was very good for both of them, as they like each other. I should never dream of interfering with their friendship. That's the way people get themselves thoroughly disliked. I don't want Jerry to dislike me, or Anne either. I like them to feel that if he is married they can go on being friends just the same." "Oh, of course, if you like it." "I do like it," said Maisie firmly. Firm opposition was a thing that Adeline's wilfulness could never stand. It always made her either change the subject or revert to her original statement. This time she reverted. "My point was that it isn't fair to Anne." "Why isn't it?" "Because she's in love with him." "That," said Maisie, with increasing decision, "I do not believe. I've never seen any signs of it." "Well, you're the only person who hasn't then. It sticks out of her. If it was a secret I shouldn't have told you." "It is a secret to me," said Maisie, "so I think you might let it alone." "You ought to know it if nobody else does. We've all of us known about Anne for ages. She was always quite mad about Jerrold. It was funny when she was a little thing, but it's rather more serious now she's 30." "She isn't 30," said Maisie, contradictiously. "Almost 30. It's a dangerous age, Maisie. And Anne's a dangerous person. She's absolutely reckless. She always was." "I thought you thought she was in love with Colin." "I never thought it." Maisie hated people who lied to her. "Why did you tell Jerrold they were lovers, then?" she said. "Did I tell Jerrold they were lovers?" "He thinks you did." "He must have understood what I said. Colin gave me his word of honour that there was nothing between them." But Maisie had no mercy. "Why should he do that if you didn't think there was? If you were mistaken then, you may be mistaken now." "I'm not mistaken now. Ask Colin. Ask Eliot. Ask Anne's father." "I shouldn't dream of asking them. You forget, if Jerrold's my husband, Anne's my friend." "Then for goodness sake keep her out of mischief. Keep her out of Jerrold's way. Anne's a darling and I'm devoted to her, but she always did love playing with fire. If she's bent on burning her pretty wings, it isn't kind to bring her where the lamp is." "I'd trust Anne's wings to keep her out of danger." "How about Jerrold's danger? You might think of him." "I do think of him, and I trust him. Absolutely." "I don't. I don't trust anybody absolutely." "One thing's clear," said Maisie, "that it's time we had tea." She got up with an annihilating dignity and rang the bell. Adeline's smile intimated that she was unbeaten and unconvinced. That evening John Severn came into his wife's room as she was dressing for dinner. "I wish to goodness Anne hadn't this craze for farming," he said. "She's simply working herself to death. I never saw her look so seedy. I'm sorry Jerrold let her have that farm." "So am I," said Adeline. "I never saw Jerry look so seedy either. Maisie's been behaving like a perfect idiot. If she wanted them to go off together she couldn't have done better." "You don't imagine," John said, "that's what they're after." "How do I know what they're after? You never can tell with people like Jerrold and Anne. They're both utterly reckless. They don't care who suffers so long as they get what they want. If Anne had the morals of a mouse, she'd clear out." "I think," John said, "you're mistaken. Anne isn't like that. I hope you haven't said anything to Maisie." Adeline made a face at him, as much as to say, "What do you take me for?" She lifted up her charming, wilful face and powdered it carefully. III. The earth smelt of the coming rain. All night the trees had whispered of rain coming tomorrow. Now they waited. At noon the wind dropped. Thick clouds, the colour of dirty sheep's wool, packed tight by their own movement, roofed the sky and walled it round, hanging close to the horizon. A slight heaving and swelling in the grey mass packed it tighter. It was pregnant with rain. Here and there a steaming vapour broke from it as if puffed out by some immense interior commotion. Thin tissues detached themselves and hung like a frayed hem, lengthening, streaming to the hilltops in the west. Anne was going up the fields towards the Manor, and Jerrold was coming down towards the Manor Farm. They met at the plantation as the first big drops fell. He called out to her, "I say, you oughtn't to be out a day like this." Anne had been ill all January with a slight touch of pleurisy after a cold that she had taken no care of. "I'm going to see Maisie." "You're not," he said. "It's going to rain like fury." "Maisie knows I don't mind rain," Anne said, and laughed. "Maisie'd have a fit if she knew you were out in it. Look how it's coming down over there." Westwards and northwards the round roof and walls of cloud were shaken, and the black rain hung sheeted between sky and earth. Overhead the dark tissues thinned out and lengthened. The fir trees quivered. They gave out slight creaking, crackling noises as the rain came down. It poured off each of the sloping fir branches like a jet from a tap. "We must make a dash for it," Jerrold said, and they ran together, laughing, down the field to Anne's shelter at the bottom. He pushed back the sliding door. The rain drummed on the roof and went hissing along the soaked ground. It sprayed out as the grass bent and parted under it. Every hollow tuft was a waterspout. The fields were dim behind the shining, glassy bead curtain of the rain. The wind rose again and shook the rain curtain and blew it into the shelter. Rain scudded across the floor, wetting them where they stood. Jerrold slid the door to. They were safe now from the downpour. Anne's bed stood in the corner, tucked up in its grey blankets. They sat down on it, side by side. For a moment they were silent, held by their memory. They were shut in there with their past. It came up to them, close and living, out of the bright, alien mystery of the rain. He put his hand on the shoulder of Anne's coat to feel if it was wet. At his touch she trembled. "It hasn't gone through, has it?" "No," she said, and coughed again. "Anne, I hate that cough of yours. You never had a cough before." "I've never had pleurisy before." "You wouldn't have had it if you hadn't been so frightfully run down." "It's all over now," she said. "It isn't. You may get it again. I don't feel as if you were safe for 1 minute. Are you warm?" "Quite." "Are your feet wet?" "No. No. No. Don't worry, Jerry dear. I'm all right." "I wouldn't worry if I was with you all the time. It's not seeing you, not knowing." "Don't," she said. "I can't bear it." And they were silent again. Their silence was more real to them than the sounding storm. There was danger in it. It drew them back and back. It was poignant and reminiscent. It came to them like the long stillness before their passion. They had waited here before, like this, through moments tense and increasing, for the supreme toppling instant of their joy. Their minds went round and round, looking for words to break the silence and finding none. They were held there by their danger. At last Anne spoke. "Do you think it's over?" "No. It's only just begun." The rain hurled itself against the window as if it would pluck them out into the storm. It brimmed over from the roof like water poured out from a bucket. "We'll have to sit tight till it stops," he said. Silence again, long, inveterate, dangerous. Every now and then Anne coughed, the short, hard cough that hurt and frightened him. He knew he ought to leave her; every minute increased their danger. But he couldn't go. He felt that, after all they might have done and hadn't done, Heaven had some scheme of compensation in which it owed them this moment. She turned from him coughing, and that sign of her weakness, the sight of her thin shoulders shaking, filled him with pity that was passion itself. He thought of the injustice life had heaped on Anne's innocence, of the cruelty that had tracked her and hunted her down, of his own complicity with her suffering. He thought of his pity for Maisie as treachery to Anne, of his honour as cowardice. Instead of piling up wall after wall, he ought never to have let anything come between him and Anne, not even Maisie, not even his honour. His honour belonged to Anne far more than to Maisie. The rest had been his own blundering folly, and he had no right to let Anne be punished for it. An hour ago the walls had stood solid between them. Now a furious impulse seized him to tear them down and get through to her. This time he would hold her and never let her go. His thoughts went the way his passion went. Then suddenly she turned and they looked at each other and he thought no more. All his thoughts went down in the hot, rushing darkness of his blood. "Anne," he said. "Anne." His voice sounded like a cry. They stood up suddenly and were swept together. He held her tight, shut in his arms, his body straining to her. They clung to each other as if only by clinging they could stand against the hot darkness that drowned them. And the more they clung, the more it came over them, wave after wave. Then in the darkness he heard her crying to him to let her go. "Don't make me, Jerrold. Don't make me." "Yes. Yes. No. Oh, why did we ever come here?" He pressed her closer and she tried to push him off with weak hands that had once been strong. He felt her breakable in his arms and utterly defenseless. "I can't," she cried. "I should feel as if Maisie were there and looking at us. Don't make me." Suddenly he let her go. He was beaten by the sheer weakness of her struggle. He couldn't fight for his flesh like a brute against that helplessness. "If I go, you'll stay here till the rain stops?" "Yes. I'm sorry, Jerry. You'll get so wet." That made him laugh. And laughing, he left her. Then tears came, cutting through his eyelids like blood from a dry wound. They mixed with the rain and blinded him. and Anne sat on the little grey bed in her shelter and stared out at the rain and cried. End of Part 18, recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 19 of Anne Severn and the Fieldings by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 19. Anne and Eliot. Chapter 1. She knew what she would do now. She would go away and never see Jerrold again, never while their youth lasted, while they could still feel. She would go out of England, so far away that they couldn't meet. She would go to Canada and farm. All night she lay awake with her mind fixed on the one thought of going away. There was nothing else to be done, no room for worry or hesitation. They couldn't hold out any longer, she and Jerrold, strained to the breaking point, tortured with the sight of each other. As she lay awake there came to her the peace that comes with all immense and clear decisions. Her mind would never be torn and divided any more. And towards morning she fell asleep. She woke, dulled and bewildered. Her mind struggled with a sense of appalling yet undefined disaster. Something had happened overnight, she couldn't remember what. Something had happened. No, something was going to happen. She tried to fall back into sleep, fighting against the return of consciousness. It came on, wave after wave, beating her down. Now she remembered. She was going away. She would never see Jerrold again. She was going to Canada. The sharp, clear name made the whole thing real and irrevocable. It was something that would actually happen soon. To her. She was going. And when she had gone she would not come back. She got up and looked out of the window. She saw the green fields sloping down to the river and the road, and beyond the road, to the right, the rise of the Manor fields and the belt of firs. And in her mind, more real than they, the Manor House, the garden, and the many-colored hills beyond, rolling, curve after curve, to the straight, dark blue horizon. The scene that held her childhood, all her youth, all her happiness, that had drawn her back again and again, in memory and in dreams, making her heart ache. How could she leave it? How could she live with that pain? If she was going to be a coward, if she was going to be afraid of pain, how was she to escape it? How was Jerrold to escape? If she stayed on they would break down together and give in, they would be lovers again, and again Maisie's sweet, wounding face would come between them. They could never get away from it. And in the end their remorse would be as unbearable as their separation. She couldn't drag Jerrold through that agony again. No, life wasn't worth living if you were a coward and afraid. And under all her misery Anne had still the sense that life was somehow worth living, even if it made you miserable. Life was either your friend or your enemy. If it was your friend you served it. If it was your enemy you stood up to it and refused to let it beat you, and your enemy became your servant. Whatever happened, your work remained. Still, there would be ploughing and sowing and reaping and ploughing again. Still the earth waited. She thought of the unknown Canadian earth that waited for her tilling. Jerrold was not a coward. He was not afraid. Well, only afraid of the people he loved getting ill and dying. And she was not going to get ill and die. She would have to tell him. She would go to him in the fields and tell him. But before she did that she must make the thing irrevocable. So Anne wrote to the steamship company, booking her passage in 2 weeks' time. She wrote to Eliot, asking him to call at the company's office and see if he could get her a decent cabin. She went to Wyck and posted her letters, and then to the Far Acres field where Jerrold was watching the ploughing. They met at the headland. They would be safe there on the ploughed land in the open air. "What is it, Anne?" he said. "Nothing. I want to talk to you." "All right." Her set face, her hard voice gave him a premonition of disaster. "It's simply this," she said. "What happened yesterday mustn't happen again." "It shan't. I swear it shan't. I was a beast. I lost my head." "Yes, but it may happen again. We can't go on like this, Jerry. The strain's too awful." "You mean you can't trust me?" "I can't trust myself. And it isn't fair to you." "Oh, me. That doesn't matter." "Well, then, say I matter. It's the same for me. I'm never going to let that happen again. I'm going away." "Going away?" "Yes. And I'm not coming back this time." His voice struggled in his throat. Something choked him. He couldn't speak. "I'm going to Canada in a fortnight." "Good God, you can't go to Canada!" "I can. I've booked my passage." His face was suddenly sallow white, ghastly. His heart heaved and he felt sick. "Nothing on earth will stop me." "Won't Maisie stop you? If you do this she'll know. Can't you see how it gives us away?" "No. It'll only give me away. If Maisie asks me why I'm going I shall tell her I'm in love with you, and that I can't stand it, that I'm too unhappy. I'd rather she thought I cared for you than that she should think you cared for me." "She'll think it all the same." "Then I shall have to lie. I must risk it. Oh, Jerry, don't look so awful. I've got to go. We've settled it that we can't go on deceiving her, and we aren't going to make her unhappy. There's nothing else to be done." "Except to bear it." "And how long do you suppose that'll last? We can't bear it. Look at it straight. It's all so horribly simple. If we were beasts and only thought of ourselves and didn't think of Maisie, it wouldn't matter to us what we did. But we can't be beasts. We can't lie to Maisie and we can't tell her the truth. We can't go on seeing each other without wanting each other, unbearably. And we can't go on wanting each other without some day giving in. It comes back the first minute we're alone. And we don't mean to give in. So we mustn't see each other, that's all. Can you tell me one other thing I can do?" "But why should it be you? Why should you get the worst of it?" "Because one of us has got to clear out. It can't be you, so it's got to be me. And going away isn't the worst of it. It'll be worse for you, sticking on here, where everything reminds you. At least I shall have new things to keep my mind off it." "Nothing will keep your mind off it. You'll fret yourself to death." "No, I shan't. I shall have too much to do. You're not to be sorry for me, Jerrold." "But you're giving up everything. The Barrow Farm. The place you wanted. You won't have a thing." "I don't want things. It's easier to chuck them than to hang on to them when they'll remind me. Really, if I could see any other way I'd take it." "But you can't go. You're not fit to go. You're ill." "I shall be all right when I get there." "But what do you think you're going to do in Canada? It's not as if you've got anything to go for." "I shall find something. I shall work on somebody's ranch first and learn Canadian farming. Then I shall look out for land and buy it. I've got stacks of money. All Grandpapa Everett's and the money for the farm. Stacks. I shall get on all right." "When did you think of all this?" "Last night." "I see. I made you." "No, I made myself. After all, it's the easiest way." "For you or me?" "For both of us. Honestly, it's the only straight thing. I ought to have done it long ago." "It means never seeing each other again. You'll never come back." "Never while we're young. When we're both old, too old to feel any more, then I'll come back some day and we'll be friends." And still his will beat against hers in vain, till at last he stopped, sick and exhausted. They went together down the ploughed land into the pastures, and through the pastures to the mill water. In the opposite field they could see the brown roof and walls of the shelter. "What are you going to plant in the 7 acres field?" "Barley," he said. "You can't. It was barley last year." "Was it?" They were silent then. Jerrold struggled with his feeling of deadly sickness. Anne couldn't trust herself to speak. At the Barrow Farm gate they parted. II. Maisie's eyes looked at him across the table, wondering. Her little drooping mouth was half open with anxiety, as if any minute she was going to say something. The looking glass had shown him his haggard and discoloured face, a face to frighten her. He tried to eat, but the sight and smell of hot roast mutton sickened him. "Oh, Jerrold, can't you eat it?" "No, I can't. I'm sorry." "There's some cold chicken. Will you have that?" "No, thanks." "Try and eat something." "I can't. I feel sick." "Don't sit up then. Go and lie down." "I will if you don't mind." He went to his room and was sick. He lay down in his bed and tried to sleep. His head ached violently and every movement made him heave. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't lie still. And presently he got up and went out again, up to the Far Acres field to the ploughing. He couldn't overcome the physical sickness of his misery, but he could force himself to move, to tramp up and down the stiff furrows, watching the tractor. He kept himself going by the sheer strength of his will. The rattle and clank of the tractor ground into his head, making it ache again. He was stunned with great blows of noise and pain, so that he couldn't think. He didn't want to think. He was glad of the abominable sensations that stopped him. He went from field to field, avoiding the boundaries of the Barrow Farm lest he should see Anne. When the sun set and the land darkened he went home. At dinner he tried to eat, sickened again, and leaned back in his chair. He forced himself to sit through the meal, talking to Maisie. When it was over he went to bed and lay awake till the morning. The next day passed in the same way, and the next night. And always he was aware of Maisie's sweet face, watching him with frightened eyes and an unuttered question. He was afraid to tell her that Anne was going, lest she should put down his illness to its true cause. And on the third day, when he heard her say she was going to see Anne, he told her. "Oh, Jerrold, she can't really mean it." "She does mean it. I said everything I could to stop her, but it wasn't any good. She's taken her passage." "But why? Why should she want to go?" "I can't tell you why. You'd better ask her." "Has anything happened to upset her?" "What on earth should happen?" "Oh, I don't know. When did she tell you this?" He hesitated. It was dangerous to lie when Maisie might get the truth from Anne. "The day before yesterday." Maisie's eyes were fixed on him, considering it. He knew she was saying to herself, "That was the day you came home so sick and queer." "Jerry, did you say anything to upset her?" "No." "I can't think how she could want to go." "Nor I. But she's going." "I shall go down and see if I can't make her stay." "Do. But you won't if I can't," he said. iii Maisie went down early in the afternoon to see Anne. She couldn't think how Anne could want to leave the Barrow Farm house when she had just got into it, when they had all made it so nice for her. She couldn't think how she could leave them when she cared for them, when she knew how they cared for her. "You do care for us, Anne?" "Oh, yes, I care." "And you wanted the farm. I can't understand your going just when you've got it, when you've settled in, and when Jerrold took all that trouble to make it nice for you. It isn't like you, Anne." "I know. It must seem awful of me. But I can't help it, Maisie darling. I've got to go. You mustn't try and stop me. It only makes it harder." "Then it is hard. You don't really want to go?" "Of course I don't. But I must." Maisie meditated, trying to make it out. "Is it because you're unhappy?" Anne didn't answer. "You are unhappy. You've been unhappy ever so long. Can't we do anything?" "No. Nobody can do anything." "It isn't," said Maisie at last, "anything to do with Jerrold." "You wouldn't ask me that, Maisie, if you didn't know it was." "Perhaps I do know. Do you care for him very much, Anne?" "Yes, I care for him, very much. And I can't stand it." "It's so bad that you've got to go away?" "It's so bad that I've got to go away." "That's very brave of you." "Or very cowardly." "No. You couldn't be a coward. Oh, Anne darling, I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry. It's my own fault. I'd no business to get into this state. Don't let's talk about it, Maisie." "All right, I won't. But I'm sorry. Only one thing. It hasn't made you hate me, has it?" "You know it hasn't." "Oh, Anne, you are beautiful." "I'm anything but, if you only knew." She had got beyond the pain of Maisie's goodness, Maisie's trust. No possible blow from Maisie's mind could hurt her now. Nothing mattered. Maisie's trust and goodness didn't matter, since she had done all she knew. Since she was going away. Since she would never see Jerrold again, never till their youth was gone and they had ceased to feel. iv That afternoon Eliot arrived at Wyck Manor. His coming was his answer to Anne's letter. He went over to the Barrow Farm about 5:00, when Anne's work would be done. Anne was still out, and he waited till she should come back. As he waited he looked round her room. This, he thought, was the place that Anne had set her heart on having for her own. It was the home they had made for her. Something terrible must have happened before she could bring herself to leave it. She must have been driven to the breaking point. She was broken. Jerrold must have driven and broken her. He heard her feet on the flagged path on the threshold of the house. She stood in the doorway of the room, looking at him, startled. "Eliot, what are you doing there?" "Waiting for you. You must have known I'd come." "To say good bye? That was nice of you." "No, not to say good bye. I should come to see you off if you were going." "But I am going. You've seen about my berth, haven't you?" "No, I haven't. We've got to talk about it first." He looked dead tired. She remembered that she was his hostess. "Have you had tea?" "No. You're going to give me some. Then we'll talk about it." "Talking won't be a bit of good." "I think it may be," he said. She rang the bell and they waited. She gave him his tea. And while they ate and drank he talked to her about the weather and the land, and about his work and the book he had just finished on amoebic dysentery, and about Colin and how well he was now. Neither of them spoke of Jerrold or of Maisie. When the tea things were cleared away he leaned back and looked at her with his kind, deep set, attentive eyes. She loved Eliot's eyes, and his queer, clever face that was so like and so unlike his father's, so utterly unlike Jerrold's. "You needn't tell me why you're going," he said at last. "I've seen Jerrold." "Did he tell you?" "No. You've only got to look at him to see." "Do you think Maisie sees?" "I can't tell you. She isn't stupid. She must wonder why you're going like this." "I told her. I told her I was in love with Jerrold." "What did she say?" "Nothing, only that she was sorry. I told her so that she mightn't think he cared for me. She needn't know that." "She isn't stupid," he said again. "No, but she's good. She trusts him so. She trusted me. Eliot, that was the worst of it, the way she trusted us. That broke us down." "Of course she trusted you." "Did you?" "You know I did." "And yet," she said, "I believe you knew. You knew all the time." "If I didn't, I know now." "Everything?" "Everything." "How? Because of my going away? Is that it?" "Not altogether. I've seen you happy and I've seen you unhappy. I've seen you with Jerrold. I've seen you with Maisie. Nobody else would have seen it, but I did because I know you so well. And because I was afraid of it. Besides, you almost told me." "Yes, and you said it wouldn't make any difference. Does it?" "No, none. I know, whatever you did, you wouldn't do it only for yourself. You did this for Jerrold, and you were unhappy because of it." "No. No, I was happy. We were only unhappy afterwards because of Maisie. It was so awful going on deceiving her, hiding it and lying. I feel as if everything I said and did then was a lie. That was how I was punished. Not being able to tell the truth. And I could have borne even that if it wasn't for Jerrold. But he hated it too. It made him wretched." "I know it did. If you hadn't been so fine it wouldn't have punished you." "The horrible thing was knowing what I'd done to Jerrold, making him hide and lie." "Oh, what you've done to Jerrold? You've done him nothing but good. You've made him finer than he could possibly have been without you. I've made him frightfully unhappy. Not unhappier than he's made you. And it's what he had to be. I told you long ago Jerrold wouldn't be any good till he'd suffered damnably. Well, he has suffered damnably, and he's got a soul because of it. He hadn't much of one before he loved you." "How do you mean?" "I mean he used to think of nothing but his own happiness. Now he's thinking of nothing but Maisie's and yours. He loves you better than himself. He even loves Maisie better, I mean he thinks more of her, than he did before he loved you. There are two people that he cares for more than himself. He cares more for his own honour than he did, and for yours, and that's your doing. Just think how you'd have wrecked him if you'd been a different sort of woman." "No, because then he wouldn't have cared for me." "No, I believe he wouldn't. He chose well." "You were always much too good to me." "No, Anne, I want you to see this thing straight, and to see yourself as you really are. Not to go back on yourself." "I don't go back on myself. That would be going back on Jerrold. I'm sorry because of Maisie, that's all. If I'd had an ounce of sense I'd never have known her. I'd have gone off to some place not too far away where Jerrold could have come to me and where I should never have seen Maisie. That's what I should have done. We should both have been happy then." "Yes, Jerrold would have been happy, and he wouldn't have saved his soul. And he'd have been deceiving Maisie all the time. You don't really wish you'd done that, Anne?" "No, not now. And I'm not unhappy about Maisie now. I'm going away. I'm giving Jerrold up. I can't do more than that." "You wouldn't have to go away, Anne, if you'd do what I want and marry me." "You said perhaps you might if you had to save Jerrold." "Did I? "I don't think I did." "You've forgotten, and I haven't. You don't know what an appalling thing you're doing. You're leaving everything and everybody you ever cared for. You'll die of sheer unhappiness." "Nonsense, Eliot. You know perfectly well that people don't die of unhappiness. They die of accidents and diseases and old age. I shall die of old age, and I'll be back in 20 years' time if I've seen it through." 20 years. The best years of your life. You'll be desperately lonely. You don't know what it'll be like." "Oh, yes, I do. I've been lonely before now. And I've saved myself by working." "Yes, in England, where you could see some of us sometimes. But out there, with people you never saw before, people who may be brutes." "They needn't be." He went on relentlessly. "People you don't care for and never will care for. You've never really cared for anybody but us." "I haven't. I'm going because I care. I can't let Jerry go on like that. I've got to end it." "You're going simply to save Jerrold, so that you can never go back to him. Don't you see that if you married me you'd both be safe? You couldn't go back. If you were married to me, Jerrold wouldn't take you from me. If you were married to me, you wouldn't break faith with me. If you had children, you wouldn't break faith with them. Nothing could keep you safer." "I can't, Eliot. Nothing's changed. I belong to Jerrold. I always have belonged to him. It isn't anything physical. Even if I'm separated from him thousands of miles, I shall belong to him still. My mind or soul or whatever the thing is can't get away from him. You say if I belonged to you I couldn't give myself to Jerrold. If I belong to Jerrold, how can I give myself to you?" "I see. It's like that, is it?" "It's like that." Eliot said no more. He knew when he was beaten. V. Maisie sat alone in her own room, thinking it over. She didn't know yet that Eliot had come. He had arrived while she was with Anne, and she had missed him on the way to Barrow Farm, driving up by the hill road while he walked down through the fields. She didn't think of Jerrold all at once. Her mind was taken up with Anne and Anne's unhappiness. She could see nothing else. She remembered how Adeline had told her that Anne was in love with Jerrold. She had said it was funny when she was a little thing. Anne had loved him all her life then. All her life she had had to do without him. Maisie thought perhaps he would have loved her and married her if it hadn't been for me. And yet Anne had loved her. That was Anne's beauty. She wondered next if Anne had been in love with Jerrold all that time, and if they had all seen it, all the Fieldings and John Severn, how was it that she had never seen it? She had seen nothing but a perfect friendship, and she had tried to keep it for them in all its perfection, so that neither of them should miss anything because Jerrold had married her. She remembered how happy Anne had been when she first knew her, and she thought, if she was happy then, why is she unhappy now? If she loved Jerrold all her life, if she had done without him all her life, why go away now? Unless something had happened. It was then that Maisie thought of Jerrold, and his sad, drawn face, and his sudden sickness the other day. That was the day he had been with Anne, when she had told him that she was going away. He had never been the same since. He had neither slept nor eaten. Maisie had all the pieces of the puzzle loose before her, and at first sight not one of them looked as if it would fit. But this piece under her hand fitted. Jerrold's illness joined on to Anne's going. With a terrible dread in her heart Maisie put the two things together and saw the third thing. Jerrold was ill because Anne was going away. He wouldn't be ill unless he cared for her. And another thing. Anne was going away, not because she cared, but because Jerrold cared. Therefore she knew that he cared for her. Therefore he had told her. That was what had happened. When she had put all the pieces into their places she would have the whole story. But Maisie didn't want to know any more. She had enough to make her heart break. She still clung to her belief in their goodness. They were unhappy because they had given each other up. And under all her thinking, like a quick running pain, there went her premonition of its end. She remembered that they had been happy once when she first knew them. If they were unhappy now because they had given each other up, had they been happy then because they hadn't? For a moment she asked herself, were they, and was afraid to finish and answer her own question. It was enough that they were all unhappy now, and that none of them would ever be happy again. Not Anne. Not Jerrold. Their unhappiness didn't bear thinking of, and in thinking of it Maisie forgot her own. Her heart shook her breast with its beating, and for a moment she wondered whether her pain was beginning again. Then the thought of Anne and Jerrold and herself and of their threefold undivided misery came upon her, annihilating every other thought. As if all that was physical in Maisie were subdued by the intensity of her suffering, with the coming of the supreme emotion, her body had no pain. End of Part 19. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 20 of Anne Severn and the Fieldings by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 20. Maisie, Jerrold, and Anne. Chapter 1. She got up and dressed for dinner as if nothing had happened, or rather as if everything were about to happen and she were going through with it magnificently, with no sign that she was beaten. She didn't know yet what she would do. She didn't see clearly what there was to be done. She might not have to do anything. And yet again, vaguely, half fascinated, half frightened, she foresaw that she might be called on to do something. Something that was hard and terrible and at the same time beautiful and supreme. And downstairs in the hall she found Eliot. He told her that he had come down to see Anne and that he had done his best to keep her from going away and that it was all no good. "We can't stop her. She's got an unbreakable will." "Unbreakable," she said, "and yet she's broken." "I know," he said. In her nervous exaltation she felt that Eliot had been sent, that Eliot knew. Eliot was wise. He would help her. "Eliot," she said, "will you see me in the library after dinner? I want to ask you something." "If it's about Anne, I don't know that there's anything I can say." "It's about Jerrold," she said. After dinner he came to her in the library. "Where's Jerrold?" "In the drawing room with Colin. He won't come in." "Eliot, there's something awfully wrong with him. He can't sleep. He can't eat. He's sick if he tries." "He looks pretty ghastly." "Do you know what's the matter with him?" "How can I know? He doesn't tell me anything." "It's ever since he heard that Anne's going." "He's worried about her. So am I. So are you." "He isn't worrying. He's fretting. Eliot, do you think he cares for her?" Eliot didn't answer her. He looked at her gravely, searchingly, as if he were measuring her strength before he answered. "Don't be afraid to tell me. I'm not a coward." "I haven't anything to tell you. It isn't altogether this affair of Anne's. Jerrold hasn't been fit for a long time." "It's been going on for a long time." "What makes you think so?" "Oh," said Maisie, "everything." "Then why don't you ask him?" "But, if it is so, would he tell me?" "I don't know. Perhaps he wants to tell you, only he's afraid. Anyhow, if it isn't so, he'll tell you and you'll be happy." "Somehow I don't think I'm going to be happy." "Then," he said, "you're going to be brave." She thought: he knows. He's known all the time, only he won't give them away. "Yes," she said, "I'll ask him." "Maisie, if it is so, what will you do?" "Do? There's only one thing I can do." She turned to him and her milk white face was grey white, ashen. The skin had a slack, pitted look, suddenly old. The soft flesh trembled. But her mouth and eyes were still. In this moment of her agony no base emotion defaced their sweetness, so that she seemed to him utterly composed. She had seen what she could do. Something hard and terrible. "I can set him free." II. That was the end she had seen before her, vaguely, as something not only hard and terrible, but beautiful and supreme. To leave off clinging to the illusion of her happiness. To let go. And with that letting go, she was aware that an obscure horror had been hanging over her for 3 days and 3 nights, and was now gone. She stood free of herself in a great light and peace, so that presently, when Jerrold came to her, she met him with an incomparable tranquillity. "Jerrold." The slight throbbing of her voice startled him coming out of her stillness. They stood up facing each other, in attitudes that had no permanence, as if what must pass between them now would be sudden and soon over. "Do you care for Anne?" The words dropped clear through her stillness, vibrating. His eyes went from her, evading the issue. Her voice came with a sharper stress. "I must know. Do you care for her?" "Yes." "And that's why she's going?" "Yes. That's why she's going. Did Eliot say anything?" "No. He only told me to ask you. He said you'd tell me the truth." "I have told you the truth. I'm sorry, Maisie." "I know you're sorry. So am I." "But you see, it isn't as if I'd begun after I married you. I've cared for her all my life." "Then why didn't you marry her?" "Because, first of all, I didn't know I cared. And afterwards I thought she cared for Colin." "You never asked her?" "No. I thought they were lovers." "You thought that of her?" "Well, yes. I thought it would be just like her to give everything. I knew if she cared enough she'd stick at nothing. She wouldn't do it for herself." "That was when?" "The time I came home on leave, 3 years ago." "The time you married me. Why did you marry me if you didn't care for me?" "I would have cared for you if I hadn't cared for her." "But when you cared for her I thought we should find something in it. I wanted you to be happy. More than anything I wanted you to be happy. I thought I'd be killed in my next action, and that nothing would matter." "That you wouldn't have to keep it up?" "Oh, I'd have kept it up all right if Anne hadn't been there. I cared enough for you to want you to be happy. I wanted you to have a child. You'd have liked that. That would have made you happy." "Poor Jerrold." "I'd have been all right if I hadn't seen Anne again." "When did you see her again?" "Last spring." "Only last spring?" "Yes, only." "When I was away." She remembered. She remembered how she had first come to Wyck and found Jerrold happy and superbly well. "But," she said, "you were happy then." He sighed, a long, tearing sigh that hurt her. "Yes. We were happy then." And in a flash of terrific clarity she remembered her home coming, and the night that followed it, and Jerrold's acquiescence in their separation. Then she said, "If you were happy " "Do you want to know how far it went?" "I want to know everything. I want the truth. I think you owe me the truth." "It went just as far as it could go." "Do you mean " He stood silent, and she found his words for him. "You were Anne's lover?" "Yes." Her face changed before him, as it had changed an hour ago before Eliot, ashen white and slack, quivering, suddenly old. Tears came into his eyes, tears of remorse and pity. She saw them and her heart ached for him. "It didn't last long," he said. "How long?" "From March till September." "I remember. Maisie, I can't ask you to forgive me. But you must forgive Anne. It wasn't her fault. I made her do it. And she's been awfully unhappy about it, because of you." "Ah, that was why." "Won't you forgive her?" "I forgive you both. I don't know how I should have felt if you'd been happy. I can't see anything but your unhappiness." "We gave it up because of you. That was Anne. She couldn't bear going on after she knew you, when you were such an angel. It was your goodness and sweetness broke us down." "But if I'd been the most disagreeable person it would have been just as wrong." "It wouldn't. For in that case we shouldn't have deceived you. I should have told you straight and left you." "Why didn't you tell me, Jerrold? Why didn't you tell me in the beginning?" "We were afraid. We didn't want to hurt you." "As if that mattered." "It did matter. We were going to tell you. Then you were ill and we couldn't. We thought you'd die of it with your poor little heart in that state." "Oh, my dear, did you suppose I'd hurt you that way?" "That was what we couldn't bear. Not being straight about it. That was why we gave each other up. It never happened again. Anne's going away so that it mayn't happen. Maisie, you do believe me?" "Yes, I believe you. I believe you did all you know." "We did. But it's my fault that Anne's going. I lost my head and she was afraid." "If only you'd told me. I shouldn't have been hard on you, Jerry. You knew that, didn't you?" "Yes, I knew." "And you went through all that agony rather than hurt me." "Yes." "The least I can do, then, is to let you go." "Would you, Maisie?" "Of course, I married you to make you happy. I must make you happy this way, that's all. But if I do you mustn't think I don't care for you. I care for you so much that nothing matters but your happiness." "Maisie, I'm not fit to live in the same world with you." "You mustn't say that. You're fit to live in the same world with Anne. I suppose I could have made this all ugly and shameful for you. But I want to keep it beautiful. I want to give you all beautiful to Anne, so that you'll never go back on it and never feel ashamed. You made me ashamed every time we thought of you. Don't think of me. Think of each other." "Oh, you're adorable." "No, I'm doing this because I love you both. But if I didn't love you I should do it for myself. I should hate myself if I didn't. I can't think of anything more disgusting and dishonourable than to keep a man tied to you when he cares for somebody else. I should feel as if I were living in sin." "Maisie, will you be awfully unhappy?" "Yes, Jerrold. But not so unhappy as if I'd kept you." "We'll go away somewhere where you won't have to see us." "No. It's I who'll go away." "But I want you to have the Manor and everything. Colin'll look after the estate for me." "Do you think I could stay here after you'd gone? No, Jerry, I can't do that for you. You can't make it up that way." "I wasn't dreaming of making it up. I simply owe you everything, everlastingly. And there's nothing I can do. I only remembered that you liked the garden." "I couldn't bear it. I should hate the garden. I should hate the whole place." "I've done that to you?" "Yes, you've done that to me. It can't be helped." "But what will you do, Maisie?" "I shall go back to my own people. They happen to care for me." That was her one reproach. "Do you think I don't?" "Oh, no. I've done the only thing that would make you care. Perhaps that's what I did it for." He took the hand she gave him and bowed his head over it and kissed it. iii Maisie had a long talk with Eliot after Jerrold had left her. She was still tranquil and composed, but Jerrold was worried. He was afraid lest the emotion roused by his confession should bring on her pain. That night Eliot slept in his father's room so that he could go to her if the attack came. But it did not come. Late in the afternoon Jerrold went down to the Barrow Farm and saw Anne. He came back with a message from her. Anne wanted to see Maisie if Maisie would let her. "But she thinks you won't," he said. "Why should I? She's desperately unhappy." She turned from him as if she would have left him, and then stayed. "You want me to see her?" "If you wouldn't hate it too much." "I shall hate it, but I'll see her. Go and bring her." She dreaded more than anything the sight of Anne. Her new knowledge of her made Anne strange and terrible. She felt that she would be somehow different. She would see something in her that she had never seen before, that she couldn't bear to see. Anne's face would show her that Jerrold was her lover. Yet if she had never seen that look, if she had never seen anything in Anne's face that was not beautiful, what did that mean but that Anne's love for him was beautiful? Before it had touched her body it had lived a long time in her soul. Either Anne's soul was beautiful because of it, or it was beautiful because of Anne's soul. And Maisie knew that if she too was to be beautiful, she must keep safe the beauty of their passion as she had kept safe the beauty of their friendship. It was clear and hard, unbreakable as crystal. She had been the one flaw in it, the thing that had damaged its perfection. Now that she had let Jerrold go it would be perfect. Anne stood in the doorway of the library, looking at her and not speaking. She was the same that she had been yesterday and before that, dressed in the farm clothes that were the queer, rough setting of her charm. The same, except that she was still more broken, still more beaten, and still more beautiful in her defeat. Anne. Maisie got up and waited as Anne shut the door and stood there with her back to it. "Maisie, I don't know why I've come. There were things I wanted to say to you, but I can't say them." "You want to say you're sorry you took Jerrold from me." "I'm bitterly sorry." She came forward with a slender, awkward grace. Her eyes were fixed on Maisie, thrown open, expecting pain, but she didn't shrink or cower. Maisie's voice came with its old sweetness. "You didn't take him from me. You couldn't take what I haven't got." "I gave him up, Maisie. I couldn't bear it." "And I've given him up. I couldn't bear it either. But," she said, "it was harder for you. You had him. I'm only giving up what I've never really had. Don't be too unhappy about it." "I shall always be unhappy when I think of you. You've been such an angel to me. If we could only have told you." "Yes. If only you'd told me. That was where you went wrong, Anne." "I couldn't tell you. You were so ill. I thought it would kill you." "Well, what if it had? You shouldn't have thought of me. You should have thought of Jerrold." "I did think of him. I didn't want him to have agonies of remorse. It's been bad enough as it is." "I know what it's been, Anne." That's what I really came for now, to see if you'd had that pain again." "You needn't be afraid. I shall never have that pain again. Eliot told me all about it last night." "What did he say?" "He showed me how it all happened. I was ill because I couldn't face the truth. The truth was that Jerrold didn't care for me. It seems my mind knew it all the time when I didn't. I did know it once, and part of me went on feeling the shock of it, while the other part was living like a fool in an illusion, thinking he cared. And now I've been dragged out of it into reality. I'm facing it. This is real. And whatever I may be, I shan't be ill again, not with that illness. I couldn't help it, but in a way it was as false as if I'd made it up on purpose to hide the truth. And the truth's cured me." "Eliot told me it might, and I wouldn't believe him." "You can believe him now. He said you and Jerrold were all right because you'd faced the truth about yourselves and each other. You held on to reality." "Eliot said that?" "Yes. He said it was the test of everybody, how they took reality, and that Jerrold had had to learn how, but that you had always known. You were so true that your worst punishment was not being able to tell me the truth. I was to think of you like that." "How can you bear to think of me at all?" "How can I bear to live? But I shall live." Maisie's voice dropped, note by note, like clear, rounded tears, pressed out and shaped by pain. Anne's voice came thick and quivering out of her dark, secret anguish, like a voice from behind shut doors. "Jerrold said you'd forgiven me. Have you?" "It would be easier for you if I didn't. But I can't help forgiving you when you're so unhappy. I wouldn't have forgiven you if you hadn't told me the truth. If I'd had to find it out that time when you were happy. Then I'd have hated you." "You don't now?" "No. I don't want to see you again, or Jerrold either, for a long time. But that's because I love you." "Me?" "Yes, you too, Anne." "How can you love me?" "Because I'm like you, Anne. I'm faithful." "I wasn't faithful to you, Maisie." "You were to Jerrold." Anne still stood there, silent, taking in silence the pain of Maisie's goodness, Maisie's love. Then Maisie ended it. "He's waiting for you," she said, "to take you home." Anne went to him where he stood by the terrace steps, illuminated by the light from the windows. In there he could hear Colin playing, a loud, tempestuous music. Jerrold waited. She went past him down the steps without a word, and he followed her through the garden. "Anne," he said. Under the blackness of the yew hedge she turned to him and their hands met. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Next week I'll take you away somewhere till it's over." "Where?" "Oh, somewhere a long way off. Where you'll be happy." Somewhere a long way off, beyond this pain, beyond this day and this night, their joy waited. "And Maisie?" she said. "Maisie wants you to be happy." He held her by the hand as he used to hold her when they were children, to keep her safe. And hand in hand, like children, they went down through the twilight of the fields together. End of Part 20, recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. End of Anne Severn and the Fieldings by May Sinclair.